This long-form narrative series will gently guide the listener through forgotten corners of history, the mundane details, the quiet innovations, and the resilient people who shaped the world in ways we rarely notice. With calm storytelling and ambient sounds, each historical tale unfolds slowly over 3 parts, designed to soothe while offering unexpectedly profound insight. Imagine you're standing barefoot on a soft beach in the vast Pacific, sometime before the rise of written navigation. Your only tools are the stars, the wind, and the rhythm of the waves. There are no maps, no metal compasses, no telescopes, just instinct, memory, and coconut husks. Let's begin. Before modern cartography, compasses, or GPS, the Polynesian and Micronesian navigators mastered the open ocean using the environment itself. To most, the sea was an unknowable force. To these early explorers, it was a readable text, etched not in ink, but in currents, birds, swells, and yes, coconuts. In fact, the ocean's surface, so deceptively calm, was a code waiting to be cracked. Navigators learned to detect subtle patterns in the water, long ocean swells from distant storms, short chop from nearby wind, or the rhythmic, opposing patterns where currents met underwater mountain ranges. Where modern sailors feared getting lost beyond the horizon, these early voyagers thrived. They noticed what others missed. Coconuts, hardy, buoyant, and resistant to salt water, drifted across vast stretches of ocean. For some, coconuts were food and drink. But for early navigators, floating coconuts became an early clue in understanding ocean currents. If you saw a cluster of coconuts bobbing steadily in the same direction, it wasn't just random drift, it was data. Observing where coconuts washed ashore, how fast they traveled, and where they came from helped island communities piece together the invisible highways of the sea. Some navigators even dropped coconuts into the water to trace the direction and strength of ocean currents over time. While this practice lacked precision, it reflected a broader truth. Successful voyaging relied on paying attention to boring, everyday things like floating fruit. One of the most overlooked marvels of pre-modern navigation was the rebelib or stick chart used by the Marshallese people of Micronesia. These charts, made of bent coconut midribs and shells tied with string, weren't maps in the Western sense. They weren't meant to be carried or read at sea, but studied beforehand, memorized like a song. The curved sticks represented the wave patterns and how they bent around islands. The shells marked landmasses. The rebelib's genius lay in abstraction. It taught the navigator how to feel the sea with their body, how the pitch of the boat changed, the way the wind sang in the sails. It was not uncommon for experienced sailors to lie on the deck, eyes closed, sensing the direction through wave rhythm and pressure on the hull. All of it began with watching coconuts float, something so mundane it could easily be ignored. Many island cultures preserve their navigational knowledge through chants and stories. The voyage of the ancestor was less myth and more mnemonic. In these epics, directions were disguised as metaphors. A reference to the whale turning to the left might actually refer to a prevailing wind shift near a reef. And in some of these stories, coconuts appeared, not just as provisions, but as messengers. In one tale, a voyager cast a coconut into the sea before leaving an island. Weeks later, a similar nut washed ashore on their home island, confirming a return current path. These stories, layered with symbolism and sensory memory, became a kind of library passed from generation to generation, their truths embedded in repetition. European navigators were astounded when they encountered Pacific voyagers who could sail hundreds of miles across open ocean without compasses. But they underestimated the tools that these mariners actually used: clouds, birds, the color of the water, the arc of the sun. Even the flight patterns of frigate birds, who rarely land on water, told stories about nearby land. But again, one of the most curious and consistently reliable indicators remained: the travel of coconuts. European seafarers began to notice it too. They saw how the coconuts drifting along the equator could point to trade winds and equatorial currents. In fact, the famous explorer Thor Heyerdahl used floating coconuts as part of his argument that South Americans could have reached Polynesia. Coconuts, after all, didn't float aimlessly. They followed paths, predictable enough to map, if you had the patience. Patience, in fact, was central to early navigation. Unlike modern travel, quick, direct, and efficient, ancient voyages often involved long periods of waiting. Sailors watched the stars for seasonal changes, studied cloud formations, or observed the daily tide cycles. And sometimes, they waited for a coconut. If a voyager wasn't sure which current would carry them home, or where a distant atoll might lie, they might wait for a coconut to appear from that direction. If it came ashore without barnacles, it had traveled recently. If it was salt-crusted and damaged, it had been adrift for too long. These were not exciting discoveries. They were the quiet calculations of lives, depending on observation. Oceanographers today model drift patterns using complex equations and satellites. But the early navigators accomplished similar tasks through slow observation and generational memory. They might note, for instance, that coconuts consistently arrived from the southeast every spring, or that after storms, the floating debris took longer to reach shore, pushed back by stronger winds or swirling eddies. While modern science might reduce this to a footnote in oceanography, the knowledge it generated helped humans migrate across an ocean covering a third of the planet. And it all began with watching the water, sometimes for weeks, until a coconut bobbed into view. Once currents were charted through drift observations, voyages became purposeful. Canoes, built with lashing and hollowed logs, followed the clues laid down by nature. These weren't test journeys, they were migrations. People packed up families, food, tools, and plants. These were not explorations of the curious, but survivals of the desperate and determined. The risk was immense. One wrong read of the waves, one mistaken interpretation of a drifting nut, and the canoe could vanish into the blue forever. But when a coconut floated west and the stars confirmed the path, the explorers pushed off, trusting the rhythms of the sea and the quiet testimony of a drifting seed. Can a coconut really be a compass? Not in the magnetic sense, of course. It does not point north. It does not spin on a needle. But for those who knew how to read the sea, the humble coconut revealed something profound. It marked the passage of time, the direction of unseen currents, and the route of survival. It is easy to overlook. But for those early navigators, the floating coconut was a message in nature's bottle, one that said, "This is the way." And so, the question lingers like a swell under a canoe. What else did they see, drifting quietly across the sea, that modern eyes can no longer read? You've now set out on the voyage. There is no horizon in sight, only a long swell beneath your canoe, and the constellations overhead. The coconut you once watched bobbing along the shoreline has long since disappeared behind you, its drift pattern committed to memory. You are not lost. Not yet. Because the ocean speaks, softly, constantly, and if you've been taught to listen, clearly. In this second section, we explore how ancient navigators used stars, currents, biological cues, and collective memory to journey between islands. We'll also look at how such knowledge was preserved, often quietly, without writing or fame. To the untrained eye, the ocean appears as a flat, rolling mass, one wave blending into the next. But to early Polynesian and Micronesian sailors, it was a textured surface, alive with signals. The Pacific Ocean, vast as it is, hides many secrets in the way it moves. Swell patterns emerge from distant storms and travel thousands of miles. These swells intersect and interfere, creating secondary patterns that repeat like musical phrases. Navigators learn these rhythms the way one might learn the beat of a drum. Imagine lying flat on a canoe, your eyes closed, your bare back feeling the lift and fall of the swell. You recognize a slow rise from the northeast, steady, long intervaled. That's the echo of a winter storm. Then there's a quicker, shorter bump from the south. Summer winds. Overlaying these signals is the wind ripple, small, rapid chop. Combined, they form a signature, a kind of fingerprint of your current location and its surrounding water. Navigators trained their bodies as sensors. They didn't need eyes. They felt direction. If the ocean was a map, the stars were its coordinates. The ancient Pacific navigators used a system known today as star paths, or sidereal navigation. Unlike the magnetic compass, which always points north, the star path system depended on memorizing the rising and setting points of specific stars along the horizon. Each island had its associated star lines. If you knew which stars rose over your home island, you could sail toward them. At dusk, A navigator would observe the rising star cluster and align the canoe accordingly. As the night passed, new stars replaced the old, creating a cosmic timetable. The Southern Cross might rise on your left shoulder and set behind you. That meant you were heading northwest. If it passed overhead, you were sailing due south. But it wasn't only about knowing the stars, it was about knowing when they shifted. Seasonal changes meant new constellations ruled the night sky. Missing this nuance could mean sailing toward nowhere. The stars, like coconuts, told stories, but only to those who listened patiently over time. In the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, an extraordinary method of navigation was developed known as the attack system. Attack wasn't just about sailing from point A to point B. It was a mental map, constructed not by geography, but by imagined reference points. Here's how it worked. Let's say you're sailing from Island X to Island Y. Along the way, you name reference islands that don't move in space, but do move in your mental model of the journey. These islands become your markers. As you travel, the rising and falling of these attack points align with certain stars. It's not easy to grasp at first. You're tracking an imaginary island against a changing sky to know your progress across real water. But for generations, this method worked. It demanded intense memorization, time, and trust. It was also oral. No charts, no instruments, just stories, metaphors, and shared knowledge. Coconuts weren't the only natural guides. Life itself offered signs. Birds played a crucial role. Frigate birds never land on water. If you saw one in flight, it was a signal that land was within 30 to 50 miles. Naughty terns returned to land every evening. Tracking their departure path in the morning helped define direction. Cloud formations also helped. Island clouds are shaped differently. They form distinct humps in the sky due to the heat rising from land. A careful navigator might scan the horizon and detect the faint difference in color or shape. Reef reflections were another clue. Light reflecting from shallow coral reefs would tint the clouds above with a pale green or yellow hue, visible long before the island itself came into view. So much detail, so many subtle cues. And yet, like coconuts bobbing in the surf, most were easily overlooked. The vessels used for long-distance voyages were not primitive rafts. They were double-hulled canoes, advanced, engineered marvels of their time. Built from planks lashed with coconut fiber and sealed with tree sap, they were fast, stable, and resilient. The double hull provided balance. The outriggers offered flexibility. The sails, made of woven leaves or mats, could be adjusted to catch winds from multiple angles. These canoes, called waka, vaca, or wa depending on the region, could carry families, animals, food stores, and fresh water. They were not just exploratory craft. They were vehicles of migration, culture, and survival. And every journey began with careful planning. Waiting for seasonal stars, watching wave patterns, observing wildlife, often confirmed with a floating coconut. In many Pacific cultures, the knowledge of navigation was considered sacred. It was not freely shared. Navigators, called wayfinders, underwent years of training and ritual. In some societies, this knowledge was kept within family lines or passed only to chosen successors. The master navigator, or Po, wasn't just a sailor. He was a living library. His body remembered the waves. His eyes recorded the stars. His ears tracked the birds. The training was repetitive. Novices learned chants that encoded star paths. They listened to elders speak of coconuts, reef glows, and cloud arches. Some lessons took months. Others took decades. In this way, the most boring facts, like the timing of a star rising or the angle of driftwood in a current, were elevated to sacred memory. The accumulation of this mundane knowledge enabled voyages across thousands of miles. Sadly, much of this navigational tradition was dismissed or lost during the colonial era. Western explorers marveled at the accuracy of indigenous sailors, but often assumed their success was accidental. Missionaries and colonial governments introduced European maps and compasses, displacing the older systems. In some islands, master navigators died without passing on their knowledge, believing the modern world no longer needed it. But in the late 20th century, something remarkable happened. A small movement emerged to reclaim the old ways. In 1976, the Polynesian Voyaging Society launched the Hkli, a traditional canoe built without nails, without a compass, and without modern charts. It sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, over 2,500 miles, guided only by stars, waves, and biological cues. At its helm was Pielug, a navigator from Satawal in Micronesia, who had memorized hundreds of star paths and who, as a child, had been trained to observe coconuts and currents. The success of Klee proved what had always been true. These ancient techniques, though boring in their repetition, were reliable, powerful, and deeply human. Even today, scientists study ocean drift by launching drifter buoys. But the principles remain unchanged. Like the ancient coconut, these instruments float with the currents, providing clues about global circulation, climate change, and pollution patterns. It's poetic in a way. What began with islanders watching coconuts float across the sea is now mirrored in multi-million-dollar research projects. The difference? The data now flows through satellites. But the questions are the same. Where does this current go? What lives along it? Who can follow it? And perhaps most intriguingly, if coconuts once told ancient navigators where to sail, what other boring things are we ignoring today that might still guide us somewhere new? The voyage has been long. The sea has spoken in waves and whispers, and you have listened closely. You've followed stars, watched the way birds fly, and noticed the coconuts drifting quietly on the surface, messengers of distant islands. Now, in this final section, we arrive at the end of the story. But this is not merely about how voyages ended. It is about what remained. The legacy of these navigators stretches quietly across time, carried in canoe wakes, chants, and the underappreciated genius of watching the natural world move. After weeks, or even months at sea, a sliver of land appears on the horizon. It's not sudden. It emerges slowly, faintly, often beneath a curtain of cloud. For early navigators, it was a spiritual moment. Land wasn't just a destination. It was proof that their understanding of the ocean was correct. To make landfall after reading nothing but waves and stars is something modern sailors, guided by GPS and radar, rarely comprehend. There was no margin for error. A miscalculation could mean drifting endlessly with the currents, starving as fresh water ran out. The success of these voyages speaks to the enormous precision of early seafarers. They trusted the coconut's drift. They trusted the bird's return path. They trusted that what seemed boring to others, repeating patterns of swells, subtle winds, and reflected clouds, was, in fact, the ocean's language. The beach you see ahead? It's more than sand. It's a testament to human resilience and the deep, quiet science of survival. When a navigator returned from a journey, the lessons were not recorded in books. They were recited aloud, sung in chants, or encoded in metaphorical stories. These stories often disguise technical knowledge inside poetic language. When the white bird turns to the south, the sea sleeps, and the island breathes again. Translation: this species of bird flies south during calmer seasonal winds, and land lies in that direction. The nut that returns is the one you must follow. Drift patterns can show you a return current. Watch the direction of floating coconuts or debris. Children grew up hearing these phrases. Only later did they learn the deeper meanings, passed on through repetition, ritual, and training. It's easy to mistake them as myths or parables, but they were something else entirely, navigational manuals disguised as bedtime stories. This form of knowledge transmission didn't reward innovation for its own sake. It rewarded memory, reliability, and that meant the boring stuff, the predictable, the repeatable, was sacred. With the arrival of European colonizers in the Pacific, traditional navigation practices declined rapidly. Metal tools replaced stone. Compasses and charts replaced star paths. Written documents replaced oral tradition. To many Westerners, the idea that someone could read ocean currents or use floating coconuts as part of a navigational strategy seemed absurd, almost laughable. These were considered curiosities, not capabilities. And so, many indigenous practices were pushed aside, labeled as primitive. In some cases, the navigators themselves stopped teaching their methods. If their knowledge wasn't respected or seen as useful in the modern world, what was the point of preserving it? By the mid-20th century, many believed the art of traditional Pacific wayfinding had vanished forever. But it hadn't. It had simply gone quiet. One of the most pivotal figures in the preservation of oceanic navigation was Pielug, a traditional navigator from the island of Satawal in Micronesia. As a child, Mao was trained to become a po, a master navigator. He learned by observation. He was taught how to recognize driftwood, how to feel the rhythm of the waves, how to observe which direction coconuts arrived from after storms. He memorized hundreds of stars and their rising and setting points. He could tell you the location of invisible islands, days away, using no tools. When scholars and Hawaiian cultural leaders sought to revive traditional Polynesian voyaging, they turned to Mao. In 1976, aboard the canoe of Klee, he guided a team from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional methods. He didn't consult a chart. He didn't need a compass. And when Klee arrived, precisely as intended, Mao smiled gently. "I never doubted," he said. His success reignited interest in indigenous navigation throughout the Pacific. Traditional techniques were documented, preserved, and taught again. And yes, among them was the humble coconut, still seen as a clue, a traveler, a sign. Today, the art of wayfinding is once again being taught across Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. Young navigators are learning not only how to read the stars and seas, but how to respect the process of slow observation. Programs now document traditional knowledge with sensitivity, recognizing that the boring details are not incidental, but foundational. Imagine a class where a student is taught to sit by the shore and count how many coconuts arrive per hour, charting their drift over days. That may not sound thrilling, but that data, passed down from elders, builds the foundation for understanding a region's currents. In an age of instant information, the practice of watching nature slowly becomes a form of resistance. A return to listening. The coconut, in its unassuming way, offers a profound metaphor. It drifts. It bobs. It doesn't appear to do much. And yet it survives, crossing thousands of miles, finding new shores, sprouting into life. It is both a seed and a compass. It is both sustenance and signal. It is easy to ignore, easy to overlook. But those who noticed it were able to navigate vast, empty seas before the rest of the world even believed such feats were possible. Perhaps it's a reminder that history often drifts right past us, unnoticed because it doesn't announce itself. It's tempting to believe we've moved past the need for this kind of knowledge. After all, satellites can track ocean currents with terrifying precision. Charts are updated in real time. Our ships are powered by diesel and guided by algorithms. But we've also lost something. We've lost the skill of noticing, of waiting, of letting nature teach us its pace. We've lost the humility to accept that something as mundane as a floating coconut might hold a clue worth following. And that leaves us with a question, one as open as the ocean itself. What other boring signals have we forgotten to read? And what might they still teach us if we'd only look? Close your eyes. It's the 6th century BCE. The sun rises over the Persian plateau, casting golden light across jagged mountains and dry plains. Along a long, dusty road, a lone rider gallops at full speed, his satchel heavy with royal scrolls. He does not slow, does not rest, because the king's message must move faster than rumor, faster than revolt. This is the Persian Angarium, perhaps the most quietly revolutionary invention of its time. A mail system, a relay of riders and horses stretching across thousands of miles of empire. Its details may sound mundane, but this early communication network shaped the ancient world and echoes, faintly, in every modern postal system today. Before the Persian Empire, no state had devised a truly reliable system to communicate across vast distances. Messages, when sent, were sporadic, tied to merchants, pilgrims, or soldiers. A king's decree might take weeks to reach distant lands, if it arrived at all. Empires were limited by the speed at which they could communicate. A battle might be won or lost before the ruler even knew it had begun. Governance was sluggish. Control was brittle. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Then came Cyrus the Great, and later his successor Darius I. They didn't just build roads and conquer cities. They built a system to speak across time and space. The boring part? It started with something simple, a schedule. At the heart of the Persian postal system lay the Royal Road, a route stretching over 2,500 kilometers from Sardis, in modern-day Turkey, to Susa, in present-day Iran. It wasn't the first road in history, but it was among the most meticulously planned. Carefully leveled, frequently maintained, and dotted with peridazish, relay stations, every few miles. It formed a physical thread through the empire. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled at it, writing, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed." That quote may sound familiar. It inspired the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. But before Herodotus praised it, the Persians were already running a system that functioned with almost bureaucratic precision. Horses were stationed at regular intervals. Riders handed off scrolls like batons. Messages that once took weeks now arrived in mere days. The couriers of the Angarium were not household names. They left behind no monuments. But they were the nervous system of the empire. Each rider traveled only a short segment of the road, between two stations. Once there, he would hand off the message to the next man, fresh and mounted on a waiting horse. This kept speeds consistent and reduced fatigue. They didn't read the messages. They didn't question them. Their duty was to deliver. It was said that in some stretches, a message could travel 300 miles in just 2 days. Unthinkably fast for the time. They weren't soldiers. They weren't messengers in the literary sense. They were operators of a logistical chain so finely tuned that its boring efficiency became legendary. What exactly were they carrying? Royal decrees were typically written on parchment, leather, or occasionally clay tablets. These were sealed with the king's signet ring, often in elaborate cases designed to deter tampering. Most messages weren't dramatic. Many were instructions, orders to collect taxes, supply soldiers, announce festivals, or record census information. Some were simply status updates, reports from provincial governors, grain inventories, or temple accounts. Dull by most standards, but essential to an empire trying to keep a million moving parts in sync. It's easy to forget, but bureaucracy builds nations. And bureaucracy, in Persia, rode a horse. At regular intervals along the royal road stood chaparkhana, relay outposts. These small way stations weren't glamorous. They were simple buildings with a stable, fresh horses, a few attendants, and food. They existed to make sure the riders didn't stop. It was here that horses were swapped, water skins refilled, and messages passed along like a whispered secret. The system was so reliable that governors and generals timed their operations around message arrival. In this way, boring little buildings in the middle of nowhere became critical nodes in a global network. There are no great epics written about relay stations. No poetry praising their mud walls. But without them, the empire could not function. Darius the Great is often credited with organizing and expanding the postal system. He understood that information, not just force, ruled empires. With the Angarium, Darius could hear from distant provinces within days. He could respond to threats before they grew large. He could verify reports, correct missteps, and issue punishments, all while seated on his throne in Persepolis. This created what historians sometimes call the king's eye. He was not omnipresent, but he saw farther than any ruler before him, thanks to his network of tireless riders. Surveillance, control, command, it all depended on one boring detail, whether the next rider was ready. The brilliance of the Persian postal network didn't end with Persia. Later empires borrowed the idea. The Romans built cursus publicus, a similar relay-based system. The Mongols, centuries later, would use yam stations to connect their vast steppes. Even the Pony Express in 19th century America borrowed the concept of fresh riders and horse relays. But the Persians were first to turn this idea into empire-wide infrastructure. They didn't invent roads, or horses, or riding, but they combined them in such a disciplined, scheduled way that their empire held together over staggering distances. It's a reminder that innovation isn't always flashy. Sometimes, it's about doing something simple, perfectly. Compared to emails and instant messaging, the Persian post was glacial. But it had one advantage we often overlook: intentionality. Messages weren't dashed off. They were thought through, composed carefully, sealed with meaning and weight. A message took days to write, days to send, and days to receive a reply. This slowness gave governance a rhythm. It forced reflection. It demanded patience. And, paradoxically, it made decisions more stable. Sometimes, boring systems are better because they slow us down, just enough to think. Most Persian mail is lost to time. Written on materials that decayed, these messages disappeared into dust and silence. But a few inscriptions survived. mostly carved in stone or etched into tablets buried beneath palace floors. They speak of trade, of land taxes, of appointments to temple duties. Nothing dramatic. But these were the gears turning behind the grandeur, the dull machinery keeping society fed, informed, and intact. And in these dusty archives, one can almost hear the hoofbeats of a courier racing between outposts, scroll clutched tight, determined to arrive before sunset. The Angarium was not a revolution of warfare or religion or conquest. It was a revolution of infrastructure, of administrative vision. It was a revolution powered by well-fed horses, alert riders, and roads that weren't allowed to crumble. It didn't change the world overnight, but it changed how humans thought about power, about how far authority could stretch, how quickly information could move, and how a king might rule not through chaos, but through communication. And it leaves us with a question. If an empire's strength depended on a quiet relay of riders and routine messages, how much of our own world still runs on systems we barely notice? The galloping hooves have faded into the distance, but the message they carried is just arriving. In this second section, we shift from the dusty roads and tireless riders to the intricate machinery that processed, secured, and organized communication across the Persian Empire. If the Angarium was the body, then bureaucracy was its brain, and like many great engines of history, it thrived not on glory, but on well-oiled tedium. We'll look at how messages were kept secure, how information was sorted, and how ordinary scribes and station attendants held together the bones of the world's first truly scalable postal system. Imagine a message arriving at a provincial capital, a tightly wrapped scroll, bound in leather and sealed with clay. Pressed into the clay is the mark of the king's own signet, a lion, a bow, or a cuneiform symbol of power. In Persia, a seal wasn't decoration. It was authorization. Each level of government had its own official seal, carefully carved and assigned. These acted as a passport for the document and protected it from tampering. If a seal was broken before reaching its recipient, suspicion would follow. Seals also served as proof of identity. In a world without handwriting verification or digital certificates, they ensured that the voice behind the message was genuine. And it was often the dull work of clerks, checking seals, recording their arrival, reapplying them when appropriate, that kept this system running. A mundane, repetitive task, but absolutely critical. The Persian Empire employed a class of bureaucrats trained in reading and writing, skills not commonly held by most citizens. These scribes worked in offices called dapires, where they maintained records, copied decrees, and drafted correspondence. The writing was often done on parchment, leather strips, or papyrus where available. The language? It varied. Elamite, Old Persian, Aramaic, depending on the region and the recipient. Many messages weren't composed by kings or generals, but by nameless clerks using standard formulae. To the satrap of Lydia, concerning the tax report due by the month of Tishrei, these scribes had to be precise. A single miswritten number could alter a city's grain quota. A misplaced seal could imply rebellion. And so, they worked slowly, carefully, silently. Theirs was a world of ink-stained hands and parchment scraps. Nothing heroic. Everything necessary. The Persian Empire was divided into satrapies, governorates ruled by satraps, who answered directly to the king. These governors acted as regional executives, and they relied heavily on the postal system to enforce law and carry out royal will. Each satrap managed a vast flow of paperwork, tax demands, military musters, festival schedules, population censuses, and agricultural updates. Most of these communications were internal, between satraps and their own local officials. These weren't thrilling documents, but they tracked the pulse of the empire. Without regular reporting, famine might go unnoticed. A rebellion might fester. A road might remain unrepaired. And once again, all depended on the reliability of couriers and the discipline of bureaucrats who filed everything away. The glory of the Angarium often goes to the riders, but they were only the front-facing edge of the system. At each Chuparkhana, relay station, were teams of workers whose job was simply to ensure the mail never stopped. These station attendants groomed and fed the horses, stored water and supplies for riders, maintained stables and roofs, noted the arrival and departure times of each courier, recorded incidents or delays in logbooks if a horse was lame, if a scroll arrived damaged, or if a rider failed to appear on schedule, these workers documented it. Their records were so routine that few modern historians study them. But they were a form of accountability, a means of tracing how long a message had taken, where delays had occurred, and whether fraud had taken place. Without them, the road would have unraveled into disorder. Not all mail in the Persian system was routine. Some couriers carried secret orders, encoded or sealed in multiple layers. Others bore inspection records from the king's agents, men who were dispatched to travel the empire, observing local satraps and reporting back. These royal inspectors were feared. They acted like internal auditors and had authority to discipline or remove officials who had grown too independent. Their reports traveled via the same postal routes, but were marked with distinctive seals and carried under guard. It is likely that multiple levels of courier existed, some common, others elite, though records are scarce. What is clear is that the same infrastructure that moved tax reports could, on a moment's notice, carry a secret order for execution. Information, it turns out, is neutral. It depends entirely on what's inside the scroll. Even the best designed systems can fail. Natural disasters sometimes disrupted the royal road. Floods washed out bridges. Snow buried mountain passes. Banditry, though rare, could target isolated stations. Horses died. Riders got sick. When such failures occurred, the consequences rippled. Governors missed orders. Military operations stalled. Grain shipments rotted waiting for permits. That's why the station logs were vital. They allowed the empire to identify weak points and repair them. Over time, regional backups were created, alternative roads, secondary routes. But the primary chain of communication always remained the royal road. It was boring. It was predictable. And that's exactly why it worked. Let's slow down and imagine a single day in the system. Dawn breaks over the Zagros Mountains. A courier arrives at a station covered in dust. He dismounts, drinks water, and hands the scroll to the attendant. The scroll is inspected, logged, and sealed into a leather pouch. A fresh rider mounts a waiting horse, tucks the pouch into his sash, and rides off. The attendant notes the time. 5th hour past sunrise. In the depires of Persepolis, scribes begin their shift. They transcribe reports, draft tax notices, and prepare outgoing dispatches. At sunset, another rider hands off a message. A station manager tallies the deliveries for the day. 8 inbound, 6 outbound, 1 delayed due to a broken saddle strap. Nothing exciting happens. No battles, no drama. But across hundreds of miles, the machine ticks forward, rider to rider, seal to seal, word to word. In our time, we no longer ride horses to send messages. We send billions of emails, texts, and pings, instantly, wirelessly. But the principles remain. Routing authentication relay nodes logs and backups trusted identities what we now do in milliseconds, the Persians did over days. Yet their model, slow, methodical, dependable, remains embedded in the DNA of global communication systems. The protocols of reliability haven't changed. Only the speed has. What's remarkable about the Persian post is not how robust it was, but how fragile it could have been. Had a few key stations fallen into disrepair? Had the scribes grown lazy or corrupt? Had the satraps ignored routine reporting? The entire system could have collapsed. And with it, the ability of the empire to govern. But it didn't. Not for centuries. Why? Because thousands of people did their dull, essential work well. This is the hidden truth of empires. They don't survive on ambition. They survive on administration. As we return to the road, dusty, quiet, endless, we pause at a relay station. The fire is low. A horse nickers in its stall. A scribe updates a ledger by lamplight. No glory. No applause. Just another day of keeping the empire running. And so we ask, if civilization depends on people doing unremarkable tasks with care, who are the couriers today, carrying the scrolls we never see? The scrolls have been delivered. The roads stretch on beneath an empire's fading sun. But even as dynasties rise and fall, systems have a way of surviving. Disguised, absorbed, echoed. In this final section of the story, we explore the decline of Persia's postal system, its quiet legacy in later civilizations, and how its very invisibility made it indispensable. We also reflect on the modern world, and how many of our most important institutions are built on similarly boring foundations. Let's return, one last time, to the road. The Persian postal system thrived under the Achaemenid Empire, especially during the reigns of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. But like all things, it faced decline. When Alexander the Great invaded in 330 BCE, he marveled at the efficiency of Persian roads and logistics. He even retained elements of the system in his own rule. However, conquest disrupted continuity. Riders fled, stations were destroyed, and royal messages gave way to military commands. Yet even in conquest, parts of the system survived. In fact, Alexander's army is believed to have used the existing network to speed up its own movements. The conqueror, in a way, became a user of the system he overthrew. It's an important historical pattern. Even when empires collapse, good infrastructure often gets absorbed. Think of the postal system not as a side project of empire, but as empire itself. Without roads, messages, messengers, and seals, there could be no statewide laws, no unified calendar, no taxation, no military coordination, no trade regulation. The Persian Empire's existence was daily affirmed not by battles or ceremonies, but by scrolls in transit. This is a truth repeated across history. Control is not always visible. Sometimes it looks like a rider galloping through the night, scroll in hand, never stopping to sleep. When Rome rose centuries later, it built its own courier system, the cursus publicus. This featured similar relay stations, official couriers, and state-sealed documents. The Romans, famed for their roads, were simply refining a Persian innovation. The Mongol Empire, stretching across Asia in the 13th century, created the Yam postal system, complete with passport-like documents, station houses, and mandated hospitality for couriers. Again, we see the same core idea. Ottoman and Mughal courts used their own state messengers. Even Napoleon relied on intricate networks of riders and messengers during his campaigns. In each case, the principle was the same: trust the road, trust the rider, trust the seal. What began as clay-sealed scrolls under Darius continued as printed forms under modern governments. The form changed. The logic endured. Today's postal services, though diminished by digital messaging, still echo the Persian model. Regular routes, fixed delivery times, central authority issuing stamps, or seals, a chain of custody penalties for interference. Even our concept of certified mail, tracked and signed, reflects ancient concerns about tampering. And while email feels fundamentally different, its architecture follows the same logic. Message headers, metadata, IP routes, encryption keys. These are our digital seals and courier logs. In other words, we are all still living in the house that Persia built, whether we realize it or not. What makes the Persian postal system so enduring is not just its utility, but its humanity. It was not built by kings alone, but by grooms who fed horses, scribes who sharpened reeds, attendants who stoked fires at midnight, riders who endured weather without complaint, clerks who copied records with aching hands. None of them appear in the grand inscriptions. None were praised by poets. And yet they are the reason the system worked. It's a quiet reminder. History is built by people who follow through on ordinary tasks, day after day. Why did Darius invest so heavily in roads and mail? Because control requires communication. If you can't deliver orders, you can't govern. If you can't receive reports, you can't respond. If messages are intercepted, forged, or delayed, empires fracture. The postal system was not just a tool, it was a weapon of administration. A way to make power visible across space and time. And so, the scroll became a sword. The seal became a shield. The road became a throne stretched across the land. Unlike monuments or armies, the postal system left few visible traces. It did not boast. It did not shine. Its strength was in reliability. Its elegance was in invisibility. And perhaps that's why it worked. It did not demand attention. It just functioned. Consistently. Predictably. Even during storms. Even across deserts. Herodotus' famous line wasn't hyperbole. It was an observation of institutional resilience. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night. That line survives not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Because generation after generation made it true, by doing their part, unseen. The Persian postal system teaches us that greatness is often built on boring things. Schedules, maintenance, accountability, standardized formats, trained personnel. there were no shortcuts. No genius innovations. Just consistency. This can be hard to admire. We like breakthroughs, not routines. But the empires that last longest are the ones that master repetition. And perhaps, in our age of disruption, there's value in remembering that. Even now, in some parts of Iran and Turkey, remnants of the royal roads still exist, visible as faint traces along ancient hillsides. No one sends scrolls along them anymore. But for over a century, they carried the thoughts of kings and the hopes of villages. Every step of a courier's horse was a heartbeat of civilization. And though the horses are gone, the rhythm remains, transformed into routers, fiber optics, and satellites, still delivering messages, still holding worlds together. As you drift toward sleep, think of the last message you received today. Was it instant? Was it ignored? Was it written with care? Now imagine a scroll, tied with string, sealed with wax, and carried by a man who rode all night so it might reach your door by morning. Would you read it differently? Would you pause longer before replying? And would you see, in that scroll, the quiet hands of those who built history not with glory, but with delivery? You open your eyes to a frozen morning in New England, sometime in the mid-1800s. The air is still. The lake is solid. The snow has settled in thick silence. Somewhere out on the ice, the first clinks of metal echo as men begin to saw frozen blocks from the lake's surface. This is not a scene of survival or sport. This is industry. This is logistics. This is the forgotten craft of ice harvesting, one of the most peculiar and essential trades of the 19th century. Before refrigeration, before electricity, before the hum of kitchen appliances, there was ice. And it didn't come from machines. It came from winter. By the early 1800s, people in North America and Europe had grown fond of chilled drinks, preserved meats, and cold storage. But without mechanical refrigeration, cooling was a luxury. Wealthy households could store ice in underground cellars or ice houses, but the supply was unpredictable. Then, a man named Frederick Tudor, often called the Ice King, had a revolutionary idea. Harvest ice from New England lakes during winter, pack it in sawdust, and ship it to warmer climates. What sounds almost foolish today, shipping ice from Massachusetts to Cuba or India, became one of the 19th century's most bizarre and booming industries. And it all began with a lake, a saw, and some very careful measurements. The harvest could not begin until the lake had frozen thick enough to support men, horses, and equipment. Usually this meant at least 8 to 12 inches of ice. Too thin, and the ice would crack. Too early, and the blocks would be fragile and unsafe. And so, the season began with waiting. Local workers, often farmers earning extra income in the off-season, would test the ice thickness with augers or iron rods. They would walk cautiously, tapping the surface, listening for the telltale sound of cracking. When the ice was ready, the word would go out. Dozens of men would converge on the lake, transforming a quiet winter landscape into a bustling work site. All for a product that would melt if not handled correctly. Before any ice was cut, the surface had to be measured and marked into a precise grid. Workers used iron bars to scratch long straight lines into the surface, forming a kind of frozen checkerboard. These lines guided the cutters and ensured that each block was uniform in size, typically 22 inches wide by 32 inches long, and about 12 inches thick. A good block weighed upwards of 300 pounds. Precision mattered. Blocks had to fit tightly when stacked. Any gaps allowed warm air in and hastened melting during transport. Once marked, the real work began. Teams of men, with saws and specialized tools, would begin scoring along the grid, slowly deepening the cuts. It was slow, repetitive, and physically grueling. But it was also methodical, almost meditative. The main tool of the harvest was the ice saw, long, curved, and fitted with coarse teeth designed to bite through thick ice. Some were handheld. Others were mounted on sled-like frames and pulled by horses. Each sawyer followed the lines with care, leaning into the rhythm of the cut. A few inches at a time, the ice gave way, sending up curls of frost and slivers that glittered in the pale light. There was no rush. The ice couldn't be cut too quickly. Pressure and cracking could ruin a day's work. The process had to be steady, dull, repetitive. It was here that the harvest took on its own quiet dignity, a balance between labor and patience. Once the cuts were deep enough, often several inches. Workers would use chisels and large iron bars called breaking bars to snap the blocks free from the lake. With a dull, satisfying crack, the block would separate and float to the surface, where it was nudged into a narrow channel of open water known as the ice runway. From there, workers would guide the floating blocks with long poles toward the shoreline. Horses often stood nearby, waiting to haul the blocks up ramps toward the ice house. It was a ballet of balance and strength. One misstep could send a man plunging into freezing water. And yet, for most workers, this was routine. Nothing heroic, just a good day's work. The harvested ice was stacked in massive wooden structures called ice houses. These buildings were insulated with sawdust and straw, designed to keep ice frozen through the spring and summer. Inside, men arranged the blocks like bricks, fitting them tightly, minimizing air gaps. As layers rose, new insulation was shoveled between them. A large ice house could hold thousands of tons of ice, and if sealed properly, it could retain ice for over a year. Some towns had multiple ice houses near a single lake. Others built them along riverbanks to serve cities downstream. To walk inside was to enter a kind of artificial winter, dark, damp, quiet, and cold, even in July. One of the quiet innovations that made ice transport possible was sawdust. Left over from New England sawmills, sawdust was abundant, cheap, and highly effective at insulation. It was packed between ice blocks during storage and shipping, reducing melt loss by up to 75. Without sawdust, the industry wouldn't have worked. Ice would melt too quickly, cargo would spoil, profits would vanish. And so, a byproduct of one industry enabled the rise of another. It's a pattern seen often in history. Something discarded becomes something essential, but only if someone notices. Once harvested and stored, ice was loaded onto carts, wagons, and eventually trains and ships. Railroads connected rural ice fields to urban centers. Coastal ports shipped ice as far as the Caribbean, Brazil, and even India. Ice was wrapped in canvas and sawdust, packed in insulated holds, and handled with astonishing care. Crews on ships would regularly inspect the cargo, adjusting load balance, replacing melted insulation, and rotating blocks. And when the cargo arrived, it was sold to hotels, breweries, fishmongers, restaurants, and affluent households. In cities like Boston and New York, ice delivery became as common as milk or coal. Men pushed heavy carts through neighborhoods, ringing bells to announce their arrival. Cold had become a commodity. Let's picture a full day during peak season. Dawn. Teams arrive at the lake. The air is crisp still. Steam rises from mugs of black coffee. Mid-morning, the grid is marked. The first saws bite the ice. Horses snort in their harnesses. Noon. Workers eat lunch on the shore, bread, beans, maybe cold meat wrapped in cloth. They stomp their boots to keep warm. Afternoon. Dozens of blocks glide down the ice channel. Ramps creak under the weight of the load. Evening. The last blocks are stacked inside the ice house. Lanterns flicker. Tools are wiped clean. A record is logged. 1,127 blocks stored. Nothing extraordinary, but vital. Repeated thousands of times across the region. This trade, now nearly forgotten, once shaped industries and transformed diets. It brought cold to warm climates. It made food preservation possible. It changed expectations about comfort. And all of it depended on timing, labor, geometry, and sawdust. No great invention, just patience and winter. So tonight, as you sleep under the hum of your refrigerator, ask yourself, what trades, once vital, now sleep beneath our modern systems? Quiet, cold, and nearly forgotten. The blocks are stacked. The ice house is full. But the journey isn't over. In this section, we shift focus from the harvesting itself to what happened next. How the ice industry evolved from a local winter chore into a global logistical feat. It's a story of ships, trade, economics, and changing expectations, and how one man's unlikely idea changed the way the world thought about temperature, distance, and the meaning of comfort. The global ice trade has one clear origin point: Frederick Tudor of Boston. In 1806, at the age of 22, Tudor loaded a ship with ice cut from his family's pond and sent it to the Caribbean. People laughed. Who, after all, would buy something that melts in the sun? The joke was on them. In Havana, the ice sold quickly, despite early losses. and Tudor realized he had discovered a strange but promising business. Over the next few decades, he refined the process, harvesting techniques, insulation methods, and shipping logistics. By the 1830s, he had created a cold empire. His ice reached Charleston, New Orleans, and then further, across the Atlantic and eventually to India. Tudor had taken something fleeting and made it global. And all of it started with a frozen pond behind a house. In 1833, Tudor undertook one of the most improbable shipments in history, sending ice from Boston to Calcutta, over 16,000 miles by sea. The journey took 4 months. He packed the cargo with layers of sawdust in a specially insulated hold. As the ship passed the equator and endured the tropics, the ice slowly melted, but much of it survived. When it arrived in India, locals were astonished. A piece of winter, delivered into the furnace of summer. Hospitals, colonial administrators, and elite residents purchased the ice at a premium. It was used to cool drinks, reduce fevers, and create sorbets. Soon, regular shipments followed. Tudor had proven that the perishable could be made reliable, that even something as temporary as frozen water could be industrialized. Modern supply chains rely on cold chains, networks that keep perishable goods refrigerated from origin to consumer. But in the 19th century, ice was the cold chain. It was used to store and transport butter, milk, fish, and meat. Dairy farmers packed cheese in ice boxes for city markets. Fishermen layered their catch with ice shavings for the trip inland. Brewmasters chilled their fermenting tanks with ice blocks. Hospitals used it to keep feverish patients cool or to store medicines. Even morgues and funeral parlors relied on ice to delay decomposition. Without it, summer commerce would grind to a halt. Food would spoil. Markets would shrink. The ice industry wasn't about luxury. It was infrastructure. As the ice trade grew, a new domestic appliance appeared in American homes, the icebox. Made of wood, lined with tin or zinc, and insulated with cork or sawdust, the icebox became the centerpiece of middle-class kitchens. Ice was delivered regularly by cart. Delivery men, often called icemen, lifted blocks with iron tongs, hoisted them into kitchen compartments, and carefully measured the remaining stock. A household's week depended on the icebox. Meals were planned around how much cooling remained. Spoilage became a predictable equation. For many families, ice delivery was more essential than any other service. It connected rural lakes with urban lives. In cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the daily arrival of the iceman was as routine as sunrise. He moved quickly, often barefoot, carrying heavy blocks on his back with leather pads. He rang a bell or knocked gently. Housewives would leave signs in the window indicating how many pounds were needed that day. The iceman didn't just deliver a product. He managed melt rate, rotation, and stock control. He chipped off excess ice, swept away slush, and warned customers when temperatures threatened spoilage. Children followed his cart in summer, collecting slivers for their mouths. Dogs barked at the creak of his wagon wheels. It was a small ritual, repeated thousands of times, every day, across countless towns. By the mid-1800s, ice from New England was reaching Brazil for cafes, breweries, and meatpacking southern U.S. states. Where local ice was scarce, Australia and Southeast Asia, as colonial officials demanded cooling luxuries, the West Indies, where sugar barons used it to cool rum and molasses, Britain, though more limited. Given distance and domestic ice availability, some ships even returned carrying tropical fruits, bananas and oranges, preserved in the very ice they had brought. This created a strange, two-way economy. The North exported winter, and the South returned summer's harvest. Cold became currency. In the 1800s, having ice wasn't just about food, it was a status symbol. A chilled dessert, a sparkling glass of lemonade, a bowl of ice cream in July. These were signs of affluence and modernity. Restaurants advertised their ability to serve ice-cold drinks. Hotels boasted of their cool larders. Social guides described the proper way to store meat and milk in an icebox. And in literature, coldness became a metaphor for refinement. Yet behind every glittering glass was a lake, a saw, and months of preparation. Few gave thought to the labor behind the chill. Picture a single ice shipment from Boston to Savannah, Georgia. Ice harvested in February, stored until April in a coastal ice house, loaded onto a schooner, insulated with straw, sailed over 2 weeks in early spring, sold to city distributors, who stored it in urban ice houses delivered daily to local homes and shops. Each stage employed workers: cutters, loaders, sailors, drivers, clerks. Each step depended on timing, insulation, and trust. The product was ephemeral, but the system was permanent. By the late 1800s, mechanical refrigeration emerged. Early machines used ammonia-based compression systems to create artificial cooling. Breweries were among the first adopters, then meatpackers, then ice manufacturers themselves. Ironically, the ice trade helped create the demand that led to its own decline. Electric fridges arrived in the early 20th century. By the 1930s, ice delivery was waning. The iceman disappeared. The lake harvest slowed. Iceboxes were replaced by humming machines. A system that once spanned oceans was reduced to a button on a kitchen appliance. The global ice trade faded quietly. Most people today don't realize that the cold in their drink has a history, that behind every cube is a story of lakes, sawdust, and ships. And so, we're left with a question. If something as fleeting as ice could reshape global trade, what other impermanent things are quietly building our future today? The lake is still now. The saws are silent. The ice house, once filled with clean white blocks, stands empty. The iceman has vanished from the morning routine. In homes across America, quiet humming machines now keep the milk cool and the ice cream hard. But history doesn't disappear, it drifts below the surface. In this final section, we explore how the ice trade melted away, what it left behind, and why its story still matters. This isn't just about frozen water. It's about the infrastructure of forgotten things, and the invisible networks that once shaped daily life in profoundly boring but vital ways. By the early 20th century, mechanical refrigeration was no longer experimental. It was commercial. Ice plants sprang up in cities, producing artificial ice year-round. These new blocks were cleaner, cheaper, and available regardless of the season. They didn't require horse-drawn carts, sawdust, or storage in wooden barns. Then came domestic refrigerators. By the 1930s and 40s, electric fridges became common in middle-class homes. They offered independence from the iceman's schedule, and they kept food fresher, longer. The collapse of the ice trade didn't take centuries. It happened in a matter of decades. By mid-century, most lake harvests had ceased. Ice houses stood abandoned, their wooden frames collapsing into the ground they once cooled. What had once connected rural lakes to tropical ports was now obsolete. In New England, remnants of the industry lingered. Some lakes still show straight-edged scars from past harvests, cutting patterns visible in winter. A few ice houses were preserved as museums or repurposed as barns. Old saws and ice tongs now hang on walls as rustic decor. Generations who once worked the harvest moved on. Their children entered factories, stores, and offices. The rhythm of the ice season faded from memory. And yet, the skills survived in strange ways. In the muscle memory of men who once cut perfect grids, in the knowledge of insulating sawdust, in the long-disused ledgers where shipments were once recorded. The infrastructure vanished. The habit of precision remained. Though the natural ice trade disappeared, the idea it birthed, the cold chain, became more important than ever. Modern food supply depends on refrigeration, from milk pasteurization to global fish exports, from frozen vaccines to climate-controlled server farms. Today's freezer trucks and cold storage warehouses owe their lineage to the ice blocks that once floated down winter runways. And yet, few acknowledge this ancestry. The sleek machinery of today has buried the sawdust of the past. The ice trade required a quiet brilliance. Ice houses were passive refrigerators, engineered to minimize melt using airflow and insulation, without a single moving part. Packing techniques were optimized to reduce surface exposure. Transport routes were mapped around melt risk, not speed. Even the way blocks were stacked mattered. Diagonal offsets prevented collapse. This wasn't formal engineering. It was iterative knowledge, passed through apprenticeship, not academia. Farmers, not physicists, learned how ice behaved under pressure. Much of this vanished without fanfare. But it offers a lesson. Complex systems don't always require complex tools. Sometimes, they require only patient understanding. The story of ice is also a story of changing expectations. In 1800, having ice in summer was a marvel. By 1900, it was an expectation. By 1950, it was invisible, delivered automatically by machines. Comfort becomes normalized. Luxury becomes necessity. We forget the strangeness of what once astonished us. So the decline of the ice trade wasn't just economic, it was cultural. People stopped thinking of ice as seasonal, stopped thinking of it as a product at all. In forgetting the labor behind the cold, we also forgot the gratitude. The natural ice trade was, in many ways, more sustainable than what replaced it. It used no electricity, no chemicals, no artificial coolant. The insulation was biodegradable. The waste was water. Modern refrigeration, by contrast, requires energy-intensive compressors and refrigerants that contribute to climate change. Cold became cleaner, faster, and more convenient, but not always greener. This isn't to romanticize hardship, but it is worth noting. In chasing efficiency, we sometimes leave behind wiser systems. Could lessons from the past inform more sustainable cooling in the future? Across New England, lakes that once hosted harvests now sit quietly, known only to locals. Lexington's Fresh Pond, Jamaica Pond, Long Pond, Great Pond. Once, they rang with voices, hooves, and the scrape of iron saws. Now, they freeze in silence. Sometimes, you can still find old iron tools in the mud. Sometimes, hikers stumble across the stone foundations of ice houses, choked in ivy. Nature has reclaimed the industry. But the memory, in some places, lingers, thin as frost, fragile as a snowflake on the palm. Even into the 1920s, a few communities kept the tradition alive. Just imagine, at dawn, the air bites your skin as you step onto the lake. The ice groans underfoot. Your breath curls like smoke. The saw teeth bite cleanly. You follow the line, steady, rhythmically. Around you, others work in silence, coordinated by familiarity. At midday, you sit on the snowy shore, eating cheese and bread. You don't speak much. The sound of work is its own company. And at the end of the day, the lake is scarred, and the ice house is fuller by several tons. You sleep well. You've helped preserve a village's summer. There is something quietly noble about labor that disappears, when a trade vanishes not because it failed, but because it succeeded so completely that the world moved on. Ice harvesters rarely wrote memoirs. They didn't leave manifestos or protest the end of their era. They simply adapted. But in the stillness of a winter morning on a frozen lake, with a steady saw in hand, you can imagine them. Not heroes, not fools, just workers, shaping the world with each cut. The ice blocks are gone. The sawdust has settled. But the story endures. And so, the question remains. If the entire world once relied on frozen lakes and men with saws, what vital systems are we relying on now that will someday vanish just as quietly? It's early morning, and you are standing on the cobbled streets of ancient Rome. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting long shadows between rows of insulae. Apartment buildings built high to hold the teeming masses of the capital of the world's greatest empire. Beneath your feet lies something almost no Roman citizen ever thinks about, yet utterly depends on: a sewer system. Vast, complex, and ancient even by Roman standards. And someone has to clean it. Welcome to the world of the Roman sewer worker, one of the most uncelebrated, unpleasant, and essential roles in the empire. In this section, we enter the tunnels. We follow the laborers who kept the city flowing. Not soldiers, not senators, but men who carried the weight of civilization in buckets. The Cloaca Maxima, or Great Drain, was more than a sewer. It was Rome's first great public works project. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, during the reign of Rome's legendary kings, it began as an open canal to drain the marshes of the Forum. Over time, the canal was enclosed and expanded. By the height of the empire, it had become a massive tunnel of cut stone, running under the city and emptying into the Tiber River. It carried rainwater, wastewater, and filth from baths, latrines, markets, and homes. Without it, Rome would have choked on its own waste. The Cloaca Maxima was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a workplace, a dark, damp, and dangerous one. Sewer workers in Rome were low-status laborers, often slaves, freedmen, or members of the collegia, a type of professional guild. Their tasks were brutally simple. Enter the sewer, clear blockages, remove silt, refuse, and worse, inspect structural damage, report unusual findings. Like illegal drains or collapsed sections, they were known by various names, including cloacinae operarii, and they often worked under the supervision of a curator cloacrum, a public official in charge of sewer maintenance. The job was unpleasant, repetitive, and dangerous, but it was steady work. And in the empire, steady work was survival. Let's walk through a day in the life of one such worker. You arrive at dawn. You carry tools, a short-handled shovel, a heavy leather satchel, a hooked rod, a lamp fueled by olive oil. You wear coarse wool clothing, thick leather boots, and a scarf soaked in vinegar to dull the stench. You and your team climb down through a maintenance shaft, a narrow stone tunnel slick with moisture. The light dims. The walls sweat. The air grows heavier. Below, you begin scraping muck from the channel floor. It's slow work. You squat in the filth, pushing waste into baskets hauled out by ropes. There's no glory here. No applause. Just the sound of trickling water and the occasional rat skittering past your feet. But when the blockage is cleared, the water rushes freely again. And that means the city lives. The sewer workers didn't use machines. They relied on hooks and rods to fish out debris, scrapers to clean stone channels, buckets to remove compacted sediment, stone chisels for dislodging build-up, oil lamps for light. Constantly flickering in the damp air, tools were often passed down, reused, and customized. A worker might sharpen a hook to suit his hand. He knew its weight by feel. Their tools weren't advanced, but they were consistent. In a system measured in centuries, that was enough. The Roman sewers collected everything. Kitchen scraps, rotting vegetables, animal bones, human waste, lost jewelry, broken pottery, storm runoff, construction debris. Sewer workers had to be cautious. Sharp pottery shards could slice bare hands. Bones could jam the flow. Sometimes, they even found dead bodies, infants or criminals, discarded in the dark. They were expected to report these to the city authorities. Occasionally, the workers might find something valuable, a dropped coin, a bit of gold, a ring washed down from a bathhouse. But most of the time, they found only sludge. The sewers of Rome had a distinct stench, a mix of decay, damp stone, and human waste. Even above ground, the smell of latrines and bathhouses sometimes crept through the grates. The workers themselves carried this scent home. It soaked into their clothes and skin. Some neighborhoods, especially near the river or forum, were notorious for their foul odor. In a city of over 1 million people, waste was constant. During the hot summer months, the stench thickened. Sewer workers were sometimes dispatched daily to clear drains and flush channels with buckets of water. For the average Roman, the smell was part of life. For the worker, it was their livelihood. The job was physically dangerous. Cave-ins occurred when tunnel walls weakened, gas pockets could cause suffocation or explosions from trapped methane. Drowning was a real risk during flash floods. Infection was constant. Cuts could fester in the filthy water. Rats and snakes sometimes nested in dry sections. There was no safety gear, no respirators, no antiseptics, just vinegar-soaked rags and hope. And yet, they returned day after day, because the work was steady, and without them, the great city of Rome would grind to a halt. Despite its filth, the Roman sewer system was a marvel. Gravity-powered, carefully sloped channels, vaulted tunnels, maintenance access, shafts, water inlets from aqueducts for flushing. It worked for centuries. And much of it still exists, intact beneath the streets of modern Rome. The Cloaca Maxima is still visible today. You can walk past it, hear water moving beneath your feet, and know that somewhere, long ago, a man knelt in the dark to keep it flowing. The Romans were deeply religious, even about sewers. Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer, had her own shrine. Workers sometimes made offerings before descending, seeking protection in the depths. For the Romans, even waste had a divine overseer, because every part of life, no matter how humble, was part of the Roman order. So much of ancient Rome has crumbled, forums, temples, theaters, but the sewers endure, not because they were beautiful, but because they were useful, because someone maintained them. And beneath that endurance lies a question. If an empire's greatness depended on men shoveling muck in silence, what foundations of our world are hidden in the dark, still being kept alive by unseen hands? The tunnels wind farther beneath Rome. You've left daylight behind. The roar of the forum fades, replaced by dripping water and echoing footsteps. Here in the belly of the city, the empire's image of grandeur dissolves. Marble gives way to grime. The roar of politics and pageantry gives way to labor, endless, repetitive, and forgotten. In this section, we continue tracing the life of a Roman sewer worker, how their job shaped the social and physical city above, and how, despite the filth, they lived with quiet pride, survival, and purpose. While most modern associations with sewers involve emergencies, floods, overflows, epidemics, Roman sewer work was routine. The city generated thousands of tons of organic waste per year. Without scheduled maintenance, the drainage channels would clog, flood, or collapse. Workers cleared latrine pipes, storm drains, and market runoff almost daily. After festivals and public feasts, special cleanups were required. They followed established schedules, written orders from municipal officials, and even complaints from citizens about foul smells near grates or blocked water flow. Sewer cleaning wasn't reactionary. It was built into the machinery of the city, like sweeping streets or collecting taxes. Just another job, but a necessary one. The roads above the sewers were no paradise either. Rome's streets were dirty, noisy, and often dangerously congested. Garbage was regularly tossed into alleys. Human waste, chamber pots, and leftover food were dumped into the street gutters, sometimes called cloacae minores, minor drains connected to the larger system. Even public urinals, fecae, emptied into the underground network. As such, sewer workers were part of a broader urban sanitation system that included street sweepers, water bearers, and latrine attendants. Together, they maintained the illusion of Roman cleanliness. Because while aqueducts brought in water, only the sewers took filth away. And as always, what went down had to be managed by someone. Sewer workers were at the bottom of the Roman social ladder, but not necessarily slaves. Most were freedmen or poor citizens. Some belonged to professional guilds, collegia cloacarum, offering them a shared identity and limited legal protections. Yet their status was low. They handled the impure. Their job was physically contaminating and socially humiliating. In Roman culture, purity mattered, spiritual, physical, and moral. The more closely one worked with human waste, the more one was associated with the profane. Sewer workers were often barred from sacred spaces, public offices, and elite gatherings. And yet, Rome needed them. It's a paradox seen often in history. The lower the status, the greater the dependence. Wages for sewer workers varied. Some were public employees, paid from the municipal budget. Others worked on private contracts, cleaning private villa drainage systems, latrine pits, or bathhouse channels. Their pay wasn't generous, but it was reliable. The city always needed sewer workers, especially during summer when rot and plague threatened. Most lived in crowded neighborhoods, insulae, in the Subura or Trastevere districts. They lived among butchers, tanners, and other laborers. The air often smelled of urine, leather, and smoke. But compared to day laborers or unskilled slaves, sewer workers had a certain security. Their work had structure. Their schedule was known. Their purpose was clear. And in a city of 1 million, that was worth something. Rome's water system wasn't just about bringing water in. It was about using it wisely. Many sewer flows were fed directly by aqueduct runoff, carefully diverted to flush the system. Public baths, for example, released vast quantities of water each day. This wasn't wasted. The outflow flushed sewer channels and helped prevent buildup. Sewer workers had to coordinate with aqueduct maintenance crews. Timing mattered. A cleaning was easier if done just after a bath emptied. Flow strength could be adjusted. Some drains were timed to carry peak water pressure. This integration between clean water and waste was a mark of Roman engineering, and a quiet burden on the men who navigated its depths. Rome's government used sewers for more than sanitation. From time to time, inspectors, often officials or scribes, accompanied workers to check for illegal drainage pipes, unlicensed waste dumping, structural tampering, unauthorized building connections, hidden passageways beneath buildings. Yes, some citizens tried to exploit the sewers. They dumped industrial waste, rerouted drains, or built illegal shops over maintenance hatches. In rare cases, the sewers were used to smuggle goods or escape detection. Sewer workers thus became informants, guides, and assistants to these inspections. They knew the tunnels better than anyone. They could spot changes. They could guide officials through the dark. They were not just janitors. They were caretakers of the city's hidden map. Sewer work was rarely dramatic. But sometimes, the unexpected occurred. Sinkholes opening beneath buildings, collapsed tunnels caving in under foot traffic, strange animals, including boars, eels, and large rats, criminal caches of coins or stolen goods, unregistered corpses, sometimes infants, sometimes evidence of foul play when such things were found. Protocol dictated reporting to the authorities. Some workers carried whistles or bells to signal emergencies. Others relied on runners stationed above ground to relay messages. In a world without radios, emergencies traveled by shout and sprint. To the modern imagination, Rome often seems grand and clean, columns and marble. But in truth, it was a smelly city. Public toilets were shared by dozens. Chamber pots were emptied from balconies. Market waste baked in the sun. Dead animals rotted in alleys. Blood drained from butcher shops. The sewers helped, but they couldn't eliminate the smell. They channeled it, delayed it, hid it beneath stone. For sewer workers, this was the job, managing decay. Not eliminating it, just keeping it below the surface. Some workers observed personal rituals before entering the tunnels. A whispered prayer, a touch to the Cloacina's shrine, a coin tossed into the channel. There was no guarantee of safety, but the act helped. Superstition offered order where safety gear did not. Once inside, the work had a rhythm. Scrape, load, haul, flush, patch, mark. They tracked their work with chalk marks or scratches. They knew which sections had been cleared, which needed return visits, and which were best avoided altogether. Their journals didn't survive history, but the grooves in the tunnel stones did. The sewer system of Rome remains one of the greatest engineering feats in human history. But its survival didn't depend solely on architects or emperors. It depended on those who kept it clean. They are barely named in records, not pictured in frescoes, not honored with statues. Yet for centuries, their work allowed Rome to grow, thrive, and breathe. And so, we ask, what other great cities today are held aloft by hands that history forgets to mention? The lantern flickers low. You crouch beneath stone arches, knee-deep in mud and runoff. The Cloaca Maxima flows behind you, a steady, grim current that has seen centuries pass overhead. You're not a senator, not a soldier, not even a merchant, but you're vital. As we close this story, we'll explore what sewer workers left behind, how their work shaped the future of sanitation, and why their forgotten contributions still echo through the foundations of every modern city. Let's begin with the obvious. The Cloaca Maxima still exists. Over 2,500 years after it was begun, parts of it continue to drain water beneath the streets of modern Rome. Some sections are even still in use, integrated into newer systems. While the Roman Empire itself collapsed, this subterranean artery remained. It outlived emperors. It outlasted invasions. It persisted through earthquakes, fires, and neglect. Why? Because someone maintained it. Because generation after generation of sewer workers descended into the darkness, hauled out the waste, and kept the channels clear. Rome's sewer system is not just an engineering triumph. It's a triumph of routine maintenance. Romans didn't think of sanitation the way we do today. They had no germ theory, no concept of bacteria, but they did value order, flow, and appearance. Filth was a sign of disorder. A blocked drain meant disruption. A foul-smelling street invited scorn. So the sewer system became a matter of civic pride. The men who worked below were not celebrated, but their labor supported temples, courts, bathhouses, and homes. They kept the image of Rome intact by controlling the things no one wanted to see. It's the foundation of a larger truth. Civilization is not defined by what it builds, but by what it quietly maintains. Despite their best efforts, failures occurred. Drains backed up during storms. Markets overflowed with rotting waste. Epidemics, like dysentery and typhus, spread rapidly. Vermin multiplied. Floodwaters forced human waste into drinking water. These crises rarely made headlines in Roman texts, but they happened often enough to spur investment in urban sanitation, maintenance crews, and inspections. Sewer workers were the first responders, not to violence or fire, but to something more insidious, dysfunction. Their efforts prevented collapse, not through heroism, but through endless, boring labor. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, much of the sewer system fell into disrepair. Medieval Rome lacked the coordinated public services of its classical predecessor. Sewers clogged, streets flooded. Latrines became private again. Open-air cesspits returned. Only in the Renaissance did interest in sanitation return, and by then, knowledge of ancient methods had been lost or dismissed. Yet echoes survived. Some of the tools, hooks, rods, chisels, remained unchanged for centuries. Some phrases about water and purity were passed down in local dialects, and the concept of a trained underclass managing waste endured. Sewer work never vanished. It simply sank deeper into obscurity. In the 19th century, with the rise of industrial cities and public health awareness, sewer systems returned with renewed importance. London built its underground channels after the Great Stink of 1858. Paris followed with Haussmann's grand sewer reforms. New York and Boston built their own networks, often learning from older European cities. But hidden within these modern projects were the same basic principles. Gravity-fed flow, regular maintenance, access, worker access, via manholes, wastewater diversion into rivers, health. Through cleanliness, the modern sanitation worker became a new version of the Roman cloacinae operarius, armed with better tools, but facing many of the same challenges. Imagine standing atop a hill, looking down at the city you serve. You know where the water flows. You know which alley always floods first. You've cleared that same block drain on the Via Nova 3 times this month. You know which homes dump chicken bones improperly, and which taverns drain grease into illegal pipes. You're not thanked. You're barely noticed. But you know the city better than any noble ever will, because you've walked its veins. There are no recorded ceremonies for sewer workers who retired. No plaques. No coins minted in their honor. But in some neighborhoods, a man who aged out of sewer work might become a public latrine cleaner or an attendant at a bathhouse. His knowledge of water, pipes, and flow made him valuable, even if unrecognized. He might teach his sons the trade, or pass along worn tools to a younger worker. His name might be forgotten, but his path was carved into stone, one step at a time, in darkness. Roman culture often mocked filth. Writers like Juvenal and Martial made crude jokes about sewer smells, public toilets, and the basest bodily functions. But under the surface, there was an understanding. These things were part of Rome. Necessary, ubiquitous, unavoidable. Sewer workers didn't argue for glory. They didn't write histories. They just showed up, day after day. In doing so, they embodied a quiet dignity, the kind that comes from knowing your job matters, even if no one says so. Today, few visitors to Rome think about what lies beneath. They see columns, arches, and marble. But beneath the stones, water still flows. Waste still moves. The legacy of the Cloaca Maxima endures, not because of architects, but because of workers. Their story reminds us that civilization is maintained by those willing to do thankless work. The dirtiest jobs are often the most foundational. Infrastructure isn't about innovation alone, it's about care. And sometimes, the most important people are the ones you never see. As you climb the ladder back to the surface, your lamp fading, you breathe deep the fresh air above. But you carry the weight of what you've seen. The tunnels, the waste, the constant labor, and the knowledge that tomorrow it will all begin again. So as the city sleeps, consider this. If empires are judged by what they build above ground, what truths are buried beneath, held up only by the people willing to clean up after everyone else? It begins with a mark, just a simple line on parchment, or maybe a sketch in a field book. It smudges easily. It doesn't shine. It is not permanent. But the tool that made it, slender, silent, and endlessly sharpenable, changed how the world thinks. You hold it between your fingers every day. You bite its end absent-mindedly. You may not notice when it dulls. But the pencil, in all its modesty, has a long and surprisingly complicated history. It was not born in a single stroke. It was shaped by centuries of confusion, error, discovery, and necessity. In this section, we trace the early evolution of the pencil, how it came to exist, why it was never made from lead, and how a black rock in England led to a global industry of wood, graphite, and thought. Before the modern pencil, there were many tools for marking. Styluses used by the Romans, made of lead or silver, which left faint lines on papyrus or wax. Charcoal, burned wood, used by artists and cave painters alike. Ink and quills, which required careful storage and produced permanent marks. Metal point, drawing with a fine metal wire. usually silver or copper, on prepared paper. Each had limitations. Charcoal was messy. Ink was irreversible. Metal point required treated surfaces. So when a new tool appeared in the 16th century, one that made clean, dark marks and could be erased, it felt like magic. But it wasn't magic. It was graphite. In the 1500s, after a violent storm in Borrowdale, in the English Lake District, shepherds stumbled upon a strange, dark substance in the ground. It was smooth. It marked their hands easily. It was much heavier than charcoal. And most notably, it made bold, black lines on paper and wool. This was natural graphite, though at the time, they didn't call it that. They believed it to be a form of lead, and so began centuries of mistaken identity. Even today, we still call it pencil lead, though it contains no lead at all. The Borrowdale mine was the only known large deposit of pure, solid graphite in the world, and it was incredibly rare. English authorities quickly took control of the mine. It was so valuable that they posted guards to prevent theft, and miners were allowed in only during specific seasons. Graphite became a controlled material, not because it made marks on paper, but because it was also used to line cannonballs, helping them fire more cleanly during war. But artists and writers soon found another use for it. At first, graphite wasn't housed in wood. Instead, it was cut into chunks and wrapped in string, wool, or animal skin. People would unravel the wrapper to expose more graphite as it wore down. Others inserted pieces into wooden holders, which clamped the graphite in place like a modern mechanical pencil. Some even used metal casings with sliding mechanisms. These early tools were delicate and not standardized. The graphite broke easily. Still, they offered something few other tools could: erasability. An error made with graphite could be wiped away with breadcrumbs, damp cloth, or rough fingers. This made it revolutionary for draftsmen, designers, and artists. No other tool offered such freedom to revise. Because early users thought graphite was lead, the pencil inherited an incorrect name. Chemically, graphite is a form of carbon arranged in flat layers. Lead, by contrast, is a heavy metal, toxic in large quantities. But the misnomer stuck. Even today, pencil cores are labeled as leads. When chemists later analyzed Borrowdale graphite, they classified it correctly. But by then, the word lead pencil was entrenched in dozens of languages. Thus, the pencil became one of the few everyday tools built on a foundational misunderstanding. And yet, it worked. In the 17th century, enterprising craftsmen began enclosing graphite between two halves of wood. The result resembled today's pencil, a solid, portable writing instrument that could be sharpened to a fine point. In Germany, the town of Nuremberg became an early hub for pencil making. Skilled woodworkers shaped the wooden shafts, while others carved and inserted graphite sticks, carefully measured and trimmed. These pencils were not standardized. Some were soft, some hard. Quality depended on the purity of the graphite and the craftsmanship of the casing. Some were sold to scholars and engineers, others to artists and architects. Pencils remained a niche tool, respected, but not yet universal. Early pencils had no erasers. Mistakes were removed using breadcrumbs, rolled and pressed to lift graphite rubberized plant sap, which was expensive, and rare pumice stones or blades, to scrape the surface. Clean soft cloths dampened with spit or water. The integrated eraser, that little pink nub at the end of modern pencils, wouldn't appear until the mid-19th century, largely in the United States. Even then, it was controversial. Some believed erasers encouraged carelessness, since users could simply fix errors. Others embraced it as liberation, a small, powerful promise that nothing was permanent. As the Borrowdale mine declined, pencil makers searched for new sources. In the 18th century, France and Germany began processing powdered graphite mixed with clay, a technique pioneered by French officer Nicolas Jacques-Conti during the Napoleonic Wars, when England's graphite exports were embargoed. This method allowed makers to control hardness and darkness. The more clay, the harder the pencil. The less clay, the darker and softer. The Conti process transformed the pencil from an artisanal tool into an industrial product. It also meant graphite could be used even in places where solid deposits didn't exist, allowing pencil manufacturing to spread across Europe and beyond. Choosing the right wood for a pencil casing was critical. Soft woods like cedar proved ideal, easy to sharpen, resistant to splintering, and aromatic. By the 19th century, pencil factories had specialized teams to mill, groove, and glue wood around the graphite. The slats were cut, aligned, and pressed together, a quiet miracle of precision. Factories in Germany, France, and the US began producing hundreds, then thousands of pencils per day. The modern pencil was beginning to take shape, uniform, affordable, and everywhere. Even as pens improved, the pencil held its ground. Why? Because it worked in any orientation. Even upside down, it required no drying time, it was less messy, it could be used in the field, in notebooks, or on wood. It was cheap, and didn't leak. Engineers used pencils on blueprints, surveyors on maps, students on exams, soldiers in trenches. It was a tool of impermanence, but also of experimentation. And in a world changing rapidly, that mattered. So here it is, the pencil. Just wood and graphite. But behind it, shepherds in England, chemists in France, woodworkers in Germany, and misunderstood minerals labeled as something they never were. The pencil is quiet, undramatic. It breaks, it dulls, and yet it persists. Because for centuries, it has offered the same humble promise, a mark you can trust, and erase, and start again. You now walk into the heart of a 19th century pencil factory. The air smells of cedar, clay, and varnish. Saws hum in the background. Rows of grooved wooden slats slide along conveyor belts. Workers move in practiced silence, pressing graphite cores into warm wooden halves. No machines speak. No slogans hang from the rafters. This is not an era of branding yet, but it is an era of mass production, refinement, and, slowly, global standardization. The pencil is changing again. It is becoming something millions of hands will hold. In this section, we trace how pencil making moved from cottage craft to international industry. We meet the companies, chemists, and quiet revolutions that brought us the tools we take for granted today. By the mid-1800s, the world was changing. Factories roared. Steel replaced wood. Electricity buzzed through cities. But in schools, workshops, offices, and armies, it was still the pencil that recorded plans, listed inventories, sketched designs. In response, pencil manufacturing scaled up. What was once handmade became mechanized. Specialized machines grooved, glued, cut, and coated thousands of pencils daily. The result: greater consistency, lower cost, and broader reach. The pencil became democratized, no longer a scholar's tool, but everyone's companion. One name stands above others in early industrial pencil making: Faber. In the mid-18th century, Caspar Faber, a carpenter from Stein, Germany, began making pencils as a side business. His descendants expanded the craft into a family empire. By the 19th century, A.W. Faber, under Caspar's great-grandson Lothar von Faber, had transformed pencil making into modern manufacturing. Key innovations included standardized pencil lengths, diameters, and shapes, branded pencils with printed names, graded pencils by hardness, H, and blackness, B. Exporting across Europe and the Americas, Faber pioneered the idea that a pencil wasn't just a tool, it was a product. They offered not just quality but reliability, batch after batch, box after box. And people noticed. With Conti's clay and graphite process refined, manufacturers began offering pencils in graded degrees. H, hardness, for precise, light lines, used in drafting and technical work. B, blackness, for darker, softer marks, preferred by artists and note-takers. F, fine point. A middle ground. HB, the perfect balance, and still the global standard. By the late 1800s, most pencils were marked with this scale, though some countries and companies used numbers, e.g., 1 to 4 in the US, instead. This small labeling system allowed users to choose their pencil based on purpose, a quiet form of customization. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American companies joined the graphite race. Dixon Ticonderoga, founded in the 1820s, would become a household name, known for its yellow pencils and its presence in millions of classrooms. Other companies followed: Eberhard Faber USA, a cousin of the German Fabers, General Pencil Company, Musgrave Pencil Company, Venus, and Mongol brands. American manufacturers emphasized practicality. Pencils became educational tools, tools of democracy, cheap, portable, and useful from farm to factory. During the Civil War and beyond, soldiers were issued pencils and field kits. It was lighter than ink, easier to use, and worked in rain, mud, or snow. One pencil, carried into battle, could write letters home, sketch maps, and record supply counts. In the 1880s, pencil branding went visual. The Koh-i-Noor-Hartmouth Company of Austria-Hungary introduced a new high-quality pencil, made with prized graphite from Siberia. To distinguish it, they painted it yellow, a color associated with wealth and royalty in Chinese symbolism. Others soon copied the trend. Yellow became the sign of premium quality and remains the most common pencil color worldwide today. This small branding decision helped build consumer trust. Even today, if you ask someone to imagine a pencil, they likely picture a sharpened yellow stick with a pink eraser. The first patent for a pencil with attached eraser was filed in 1858 by Hyman Lipman, a Philadelphia stationer. The innovation was deceptively simple. Drill a cavity into the pencils and insert a small plug of rubber, secure it with glue and a metal band. Ferrule. This combination pencil was perfect for students and clerks. It made the tool even more portable. Mark, erase, repeat. However, professional artists and draftsmen often disliked erasers. They preferred dedicated tools for correction and saw erasers as encouraging laziness. Still, the idea caught on. By the 20th century, the eraser-tipped pencil was standard, especially in the U.S. As demand for pencils grew, so did the need for wood. Softwoods like incense cedar, native to California, became the preferred material for its aroma, ease of sharpening, and resilience. But the industry's growth also meant deforestation. By the early 20th century, companies began experimenting with alternative woods, composites, and later, recycled materials. Today, responsible pencil companies manage sustainable forestry. But the early pencil boom left a lasting environmental mark. It's a reminder that even the quietest tools have ecological footprints. Throughout the 20th century, the pencil remained critical in major events. Soldiers in World War I and World War II used pencils for field notes. Scientists and engineers designed machines, aircraft, and even space missions. And graphite astronauts used pencils in orbit. Famously durable in weightlessness, writers and artists drafted novels, sketches, and symphonies in pencil first. Unlike pens, pencils didn't leak, didn't freeze, and didn't require maintenance. They simply worked. As typewriters, ballpoint pens, and eventually computers emerged, the pencil's role shrank. But it didn't vanish. It became a child's first writing tool, an artist's expressive implement, a symbol of revision and creativity, a testing device for millions of standardized exams. It also became a symbol of thought, humility, and potential. A sharpened pencil waits. It listens. It does not assume. No keyboard has that patience. Now, as you turn your pencil in your fingers, consider this. Its shape has been unchanged for over a century. Its core is still clay and carbon. Its job is still to make marks that can be changed, and yet, it has touched revolutions, literature, education, and memory. So before we trace the final chapters, the decline, rebirth, and symbolism of the pencil, we pause and ask, what other tools in your life are so familiar, so humble, that you no longer see the story they carry inside them? It's early morning. A child sharpens a pencil at her desk, the shavings curling to the floor. Across the world, a carpenter tucks one behind his ear. A student nervously flips his pencil during an exam. A writer, weary of the keyboard, sketches an idea in the margin of a notebook. The pencil endures. In this final section, we explore how the pencil has remained with us in an increasingly digital age, why it refuses to disappear, and how it evolved from a tool into a symbol of learning, memory, revision, and quiet resilience. By the late 20th century, technology moved quickly. Word processors replaced longhand. Tablets replaced sketchpads. Styluses mimicked the look of graphite with pixel precision. Correction became effortless, not an eraser, but a backspace key. For many, pencils became nostalgic, a tool of childhood or old-fashioned professions. In offices, they disappeared. In classrooms, they were slowly replaced by laptops and touchscreens. Sales declined. Factories closed. Wooden pencil production dropped. And yet, the pencil never vanished. It simply adapted. In the 20th century, mechanical pencils rose in popularity. Unlike traditional pencils, These featured a durable casing replaceable graphite, leads in various sizes, 0.5 millimeters, 0.7 millimeters, 2 millimeters, built-in erasers, and click mechanisms, a consistent fine line without sharpening. Engineers, architects, and mathematicians embraced them for precision. Students liked them for exams and diagrams. Artists adapted them for fine detail. Mechanical pencils did not replace the wooden pencil, they evolved from it. A refinement of purpose, not a rejection of history. In art and literature, the pencil became more than a tool. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck swore by pencils for first drafts. Artists from Da Vinci to Van Gogh used graphite for preliminary sketches. Architects built skylines from pencil lines first drawn in solitude. Cartoonists shaped characters whose outlines began as faint strokes. Educators used pencils as a symbol of potential and progress. The pencil took on a quiet symbolism. A child's first step into literacy, a student's attempt at learning, a thinker's sketch of the unknown, a creator's first idea, because the pencil does not demand. It invites. It says, you can try, and you can try again. Unlike the permanence of ink or the precision of pixels, the pencil is forgiving. It's designed to be erased. That impermanence is part of its philosophy, a reminder that mistakes are expected, that marks can be corrected, that nothing is final until it needs to be. This made the pencil the tool of learners, where answers can be changed, designers, where plans evolve, composers, where notes shift, children, where spelling is still uncertain, explorers, where maps are never quite finished. The pencil offers grace. It is not for declaring. It is for thinking. Despite modernization, pencil use remains vibrant in different cultures. In Japan, high-quality pencils are revered for balance and precision. Brands like Tombow and Mitsubishi produce exquisite graphite tools for writers and artists. In Germany, Stettler and Faber-Castell continue centuries-old traditions of design excellence. In the United States, Musgrave, General Pencil, and Ticonderoga remain iconic. In developing countries, pencils are still essential, inexpensive, long-lasting, and versatile. From classrooms in Kenya to design studios in Copenhagen, the pencil remains universal. No battery, no updates, just graphite and wood. As nostalgia and simplicity gained appeal, a new community emerged, pencil collectors. They seek out rare pencils from the 1800s, with hand-carved casings, defunct brands, vintage packaging, military-issue field pencils, promotional and advertising designs. Some artisans now make handcrafted pencils using exotic woods, custom pigments, and recycled materials. What was once ordinary is now curated. The pencil has become not just a tool, but a relic of focus in a distracted age. Modern concerns about sustainability have led to innovations. Pencils made from recycled newspaper, biodegradable casings using bamboo or recycled plastics, brands planting a tree for every pencil sold, refillable graphite holders replacing disposable pencils. The pencil, once a product of timber and mining, is learning to adapt to a greener world. It turns out, even the most traditional tools can change quietly. Pencils have been carried into war zones and classrooms. They've written constitutions, sketched cathedrals, drawn comic strips, and filled grocery lists. They've broken in pockets, rolled under desks, been chewed in nervousness, forgotten behind ears. But they've also captured ideas before they disappeared, started letters that would change lives, helped children pass their first exams, marked the beginning of books, films, inventions. In a world of noise, the pencil is silent. In a world of permanence, it's willing to change. In a world of certainty, it remains uncertain and open to revision. No tool shows its life like a pencil does. It grows smaller with each use, slowly shaved away, shortened by work, until there's nothing left to hold. It disappears, not in a moment, but in service. Its final mark is rarely noticed. Its last lines may be scribbled in the margins. And then, it is set aside. Replaced not with regret, but with a new pencil. A new beginning. There is something poetic in that. So now, pick up a pencil. Feel its weight. Light, but real. Sharpen it. Mark something. Erase it. Try again. You've just repeated a ritual older than steam engines, older than telegraphs, older than light bulbs. You've joined a quiet history, a lineage of artists, engineers, laborers, and learners. and you've used a tool built on imperfection, revision, and resilience. So the next time you make a mark, ask, what does it mean to use a tool that's designed, from the start, to let you change your mind? The walls are cold. The candles flicker. Outside, wind howls across the monastery courtyard. But within these thick stone walls, a small group of monks work in silence, heads bowed, quills in hand, focused entirely on the page in front of them. They are not writing their own thoughts. They are copying ancient texts, the Bible, sermons, histories, and sometimes herbal recipes or weather records. And at the heart of it all is ink. Not the store-bought kind. Not the kind poured from a bottle with a label, but ink that was mixed, heated, stirred, and strained in the back rooms of monasteries using plants, minerals, and the knowledge of centuries. This is the story of medieval ink, how monks made it, why it mattered, and what it tells us about a world where every word was permanent and every ingredient had meaning. In medieval Europe, especially between the 6th and 12th centuries, monasteries were the primary centers of literacy. Monks were not just men of prayer. They were scribes, editors, illuminators, and bookbinders. Their job was to preserve sacred knowledge and, over time, to copy it by hand, letter by letter. Each manuscript could take months or even years to complete. Mistakes were costly. Materials were expensive. And at the core of every manuscript was ink, the medium that gave shape to thought. Before gold leaf, before illustrations, before even parchment, there was the quiet ritual of ink making. The scriptorium was not a grand library. It was a working space. Typically cold, windowed, and austere, it was designed to limit distraction and promote order. Monks sat at wooden desks or writing frames, often facing walls, not each other. There was little talking, often none at all. Each monk worked by daylight or candlelight, copying from a master text. He held a quill pen, dipped it into ink, and wrote slowly across sheets of vellum or parchment, prepared animal skin. But before any writing began, someone had to mix the ink, and that was its own art. The most common ink in medieval Europe was called iron gall ink. It sounds alchemical, and it was. Its ingredients were simple, but the process was exact. The base recipe involved oak galls, abnormal growths formed when gall wasps lay eggs in oak leaves. Rich in tannic acid. Iron salts, usually iron sulfate, derived from rust or ground minerals. Water, often rainwater or distilled. Gum arabic, the resin of the acacia tree, used as a binder to help ink adhere to the page. Sometimes, wine or vinegar, added to preserve or strengthen the ink. When tannic acid from the galls reacts with iron salts, it produces a deep blue-black ink that oxidizes and darkens as it dries. Simple in theory, tricky in practice. Ink making wasn't just chemistry, it was also agriculture and patience. Monks or lay brothers collected oak galls during the summer, often from specific trees known to produce the best ones. The galls were dried, crushed, and soaked. Iron salts were scraped from rusty nails, metal tools, or bought from apothecaries. The mixture was left to ferment, sometimes for weeks. Once strained and stabilized with gum arabic, it could be used immediately or stored in glass or ceramic jars. Each monastery had its own variation. Some added saffron for warmth, honey for flow, or copper salts for sheen. The recipes were often written in Latin, kept secret, and passed between scriptoria as precious knowledge. Ink needed a worthy partner, the quill. Monks typically used feathers from geese, swans, or crows, plucked during molting seasons. The best feathers came from the left wing, whose natural curve suited right-handed writing. Preparing a quill was itself a craft. The feather was hardened by soaking in water and drying in hot sand. The nib was cut at an angle with a small knife, the penknife. The slit allowed ink to flow evenly. The monk regularly reshaped the tip with a whetstone. A good quill might last for a few weeks. A poor one would splatter or blot. Ink revealed its true beauty only through a perfect pen. Parchment and vellum were not like modern paper. They were made from animal skin, carefully stretched, scraped, and dried. They absorbed ink differently. Too much and it bled, too little and it flaked. Some pages were treated with chalk or lime to create a smoother surface. Monks had to adjust ink thickness, flow, and drying time depending on the manuscript. Scribes sometimes tested the ink at the page's edge, a practice visible in margin scribbles and faded test marks still seen today in medieval manuscripts. Black was the workhorse, but manuscripts also included colored inks, especially in rubrics, red headings, illuminations, and initials. Common pigments included red, cinnabar or minium, blue, lapis lazuli or azurite, green, verdigris or malachite, gold leaf, applied with glue or egg white silver or lead white. These were mixed with binders, egg yolk, gum arabic, or fish glue, and applied with special brushes or pens. Colored inks were rarer, more costly, and more decorative, but even they relied on the same core knowledge, chemistry, storage, and patience. Iron gall ink was beautiful, but it had a dark side. It corroded over time, especially when used too heavily. Manuscripts sometimes show burn-through, where ink ate through the parchment. When exposed to moisture, the ink could fade or run. In rare cases, badly made ink caused entire books to rot from within. This made proper preparation essential. A poorly mixed batch might destroy months of work, and once written, the ink was permanent. Errors could not be erased. They had to be scraped off with a blade, and even then, the ghost of the words remained. Picture the scene. A monk stands in a dim room, grinding oak galls on a stone. Nearby, iron filings soak in wine, slowly turning dark. The smell is sharp, sour, metallic. The ink master dips a quill and tests the color on scrap parchment. Satisfied, he pours the ink into small horn inkwells. Down the hall, scribes begin to write, the fruit of his labor darkening across the page. No prayers, no songs, just the steady rhythm of creation. So much of what we know about the medieval world survives because monks mixed ink and pressed quill to parchment. Without them, there would be no Beowulf, no preserved Aristotle, no illuminated Gospels. But we don't know the names of most who mixed the ink. We only see their work, and we're left to wonder how many forgotten hands stirred oak galls and rust in quiet corners of history, never knowing that their ink would last 1,000 years. The candles burn low in the scriptorium. Outside, frost clings to the cloisters. Inside, a monk pauses, lifts his quill, and dips it into ink the color of midnight. He leans forward, careful not to smear the drying lines beneath his hand. This is not hurried writing. This is preservation of knowledge, of language, of faith. And it all depends on the quality of a black liquid, brewed by hand, in the back of the monastery. In this second section, we follow the ink across the page, into the manuscripts it shaped, the scribes who depended on it, and the silent systems that sustained it for centuries. From forgotten recipes to quietly enduring texts, we explore how ink served as the lifeblood of the medieval written world. In an age before printing, every letter was a decision. The average scribe might copy 20 to 40 lines per day, depending on the script and the complexity. Each word was checked and cross-checked. There was no autocorrect, no delete key, only the blade, a last resort for scraping away errors. Ink was not wasted. A scribe dipping too often would create blots. Waiting too long between dips could break the flow. Some wrote letters with a single dip. Others paused often to avoid smudging. This discipline shaped how language looked. It also meant ink recipes had to be precise, too watery, and the letters faded, too thick, and the pen clogged. The ink, quite literally, determined how ideas appeared in the world. Although monks were expected to copy without embellishment, some left their quiet signature in their work. A humorous margin note, a frustrated line, "It is cold today. Thank God this is finished." A different ink shade when switching batches, decorative initials, or flourishes unique to their hand. These marks help modern historians identify individual scribes, even when their names are lost. And changes in ink tone sometimes reveal a day's passage, darker in the morning, lighter after hours of drying. In one manuscript, an entire page begins in deep black and fades midway, possibly indicating a drying inkwell or a distracted monk. Ink was not just substance. It was a record of time. Ink making wasn't constant. Oak galls were collected in late summer, when tannin levels were highest. Iron sulfate could be gathered year-round, but fermentation took time. Gum arabic was imported, and sometimes ran out. Thus, many monasteries made seasonal batches, storing ink in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth. These would be labeled by strength, date, or intended use. Winter ink might be thicker, less prone to running in cold. Summer ink thinner, easier to flow in heat. Over time, ink masters learned to adjust ratios for climate, paper, and project. Ink wasn't a static recipe. It was a living adaptation. Not all ink recipes were kept in libraries. Some were scribbled in margins, tucked between prayers or glosses. Monks might jot, for black ink, gall soaked 7 days, then mixed with iron salt and gum. Strain twice. Others wrote recipes for red or green pigments. Some added notes like, this ink stains fingers. Wear gloves. Too strong. Dilute with water before use. Do not use on damp parchment. These annotations remind us that ink making was tactile, experimental, and problem-prone. And the fact that monks recorded them, sometimes beside theological arguments or sermons, speaks to ink's intellectual importance. The act of writing sacred text was not just mechanical, it was spiritual. In some monasteries, the ink was blessed before use. Monks prayed before each transcription session, invoking divine guidance to avoid error. The ink itself became a symbol, black for permanence and truth, red for emphasis, blood, or the divine gold for light, purity, or the sacred illuminated manuscripts often used colored ink for the names of God, or to highlight Christ's words. And when the Psalms read, my tongue is the pen of a ready scribe, the scribe's literal pen, and its ink, became part of divine expression. Ink was not neutral. It was a vessel of the sacred. Not all ink was good. Poor batches turned brown or green with time. Some faded after a few years. Others ate through the page. A book might look perfect one year and riddled with holes the next. Monasteries learned to test ink before using it. They'd write on scrap parchment, expose it to light, moisture, or heat, and wait. Only after passing these tests would it be approved for copying sacred texts. Still, some errors slipped through. In modern archives, scholars have found entire manuscripts rendered illegible due to corrosive ink. Those pages whisper a silent truth. Even devotion cannot stop chemistry. Monasteries did not exist in isolation. They traded, bought, and sold goods, including ink ingredients. Oak galls were sometimes imported from France or Spain. Gum arabic came from North Africa. Iron sulfate could be mined or purchased from blacksmiths. Red and blue pigments came from distant trade routes. This meant ink-making tied monasteries to broader economic and political networks. A shortage in gum arabic in one region might delay manuscripts for months. A war that disrupted trade could mean no blue ink for the Psalms. Even something as simple as ink linked cloistered monks to the world outside. Iron gall ink, for all its faults, proved remarkably durable. When properly made, it penetrated the parchment fibers. It resisted smudging and could withstand centuries of handling. This is why so many medieval texts have survived, not just because of the care in writing, but because of the chemistry of the ink. Even now, libraries preserve thousand-year-old manuscripts where the ink is still dark, still crisp, still legible. The words remain not only because of prayer or scholarship, but because someone mixed the right amount of gall, rust, and resin. In larger monasteries, one monk might be assigned as the ink master, not a title of glory, but of trust. He knew the ratios, the timing, the sources. He recorded successful batches and failures. He trained apprentices, sometimes in secret. When he died, his recipes were preserved, sometimes in bound books, sometimes in cryptic margin notes, sometimes just through oral instruction. We rarely know their names, but their legacy is written across every page of preserved medieval thought. The ink dries. The quill is set aside. The candle sputters. The scribe closes the manuscript and exhales. The page is done, but it leaves us with a lingering question. If something as fragile as a wasp gall and a bit of rust can create a mark that lasts 1,000 years, what quiet tools are we using today that might outlast us all? The sun is low. The scriptorium grows colder. A scribe lifts his eyes from the page, not in boredom, but in reverence. He has completed the final word. He seals it with a red flourish, folds his hands in silent prayer, and sets the manuscript aside. It is not his work, not his words, not his glory, but it is his mark, ink on skin, thoughts carried in chemical permanence. In this final section, we explore the fading but lingering influence of monastic ink making. How it quietly slipped into obsolescence, how its recipes became curiosities, and how the stains left behind still whisper through the cracks of history. By the late Middle Ages, the monopoly on written production began to shift. Universities became new centers of literacy. Lay scribes and clerks took over secular writing. Printing presses, introduced in the mid-15th century by Gutenberg, made hand copying increasingly obsolete, and with them, the art of ink-making changed. Monasteries still made ink, but less often. They began buying ink from professional apothecaries or ink merchants in nearby towns. By the 17th century, few monasteries maintained their own recipes. The scriptorium quieted. The ink pots dried. And yet, the words those monks had written remained. As ink production became industrialized, some of the richness of monastic tradition was lost. Seasonal variations disappeared. Local pigments were replaced by standardized rituals of prayer and blessing. Faded regional recipes, once passed from monk to monk, were discarded for efficiency. Ink became a product, not a process. And while it improved in consistency, it lost its sense of place. No longer tied to a hillside monastery, a specific oak grove, or the hands that stirred it under moonlight. What was gained in speed was lost in intimacy. Even now, if you walk into the archives of a cathedral, monastery, or university, you'll find manuscripts made with monk-mixed ink, deep black strokes, still legible brown marginalia, curling at the edges red rubrics announcing a new psalm or gospel, flecks of gold in the corners of illuminated capitals. Many of these books were never meant to be famous. They were working texts, Bibles, sermons, calendars, herbals, commentaries. But the ink gave them life. Without ink, the parchment is mute. With ink, it speaks. Modern scientists study medieval ink using spectroscopy to analyze chemical content, infrared imaging to read erased or hidden text, microscopy to examine ink layering and corrosion. They've learned iron gall ink corrodes when applied too heavily or stored improperly. Tannin content varies based on the species of oak and region of collection. Additives like wine, honey, and vinegar affected longevity, but much remains unclear. Many ink recipes were never written down, or if they were vague. Add galls until it darkens, stir until it smells sweet, strain when the color is true. Science can analyze the ink, but it cannot always explain the intuition behind it. For centuries, ink was used metaphorically. Spilling ink, writing at length in black and white, recorded, finalized, clear, permanent as ink. Lasting, indelible. Monks, though, lived these metaphors. They did not write quickly. They wrote slowly, deliberately, with an awareness that each drop of ink was a moment captured in time. To blot was to mar the text. To misspell was to mar the meaning. Ink was not merely a tool. It was a responsibility. In some manuscripts, we find ink that has bloomed, where iron and tannin have corroded the parchment in gentle, floral-like patterns. Others reveal where a quill has paused too long, creating a dark pool, or where a scribe corrected an error, leaving behind a scar. These marks are not mistakes. They are the fingerprints of effort. They remind us, this was not printed. This was crafted. Each splotch and smudge tells a human story, one of fatigue, attention, learning, and repetition. Imagine a young monk, 800 years ago. He stands in the monastery garden, picking dried galls from an oak tree. He carries them in a woven pouch. He returns to the workshop. He grinds them on a stone, adds rainwater, waits. The ink master shows him how to stir without aerating, when to strain, how to judge color by eye alone. The apprentice listens, learns, records nothing, because it's all done by feel. And one day, he takes over. The recipe remains unwritten, but it continues, not in books, but in hands. Today, a small group of calligraphers, historians, and ink artisans work to recreate monastic ink. They follow ancient recipes. They boil oak galls. They order iron sulfate from chemical suppliers. They grow acacia trees for gum. Some even write on homemade parchment with goose quills by candlelight, not for nostalgia, but to understand. Because there is something profoundly human in that moment. A hand, a pen, a drop of ink, and a blank page. Occasionally, a scribe left a note at the end of a manuscript. I wrote this with aching hand and dim eyes. May it serve the reader well. Pray for me, for I have labored long over this work. If you find error, correct it with charity. These weren't vanity. They were confessions. The ink was the scribe's voice. And sometimes, in the final line, he allowed himself to whisper. The next time you hold a pen or type a word, pause for a moment. Think of the ink-stained hands, the rust and the resin, the monks bent in silence, the oak trees that bore galls, the careful stirring in a stone bowl, the testing, the prayers, the lines. So much effort behind so simple a thing. So ask yourself, if 1,000 years from now, someone reads your words, what will your ink say about the care with which you wrote them? You awaken in a damp hut on stilts, the morning fog coiling over the lagoon like a sleeping animal. The air smells briny. You step outside, and before you, stretched across the shallows, are rows of shimmering salt pans. Men move quietly, scraping crystalline flakes with wooden rakes. The Adriatic sparkles beyond. This is not the height of empire. Not yet. This is early Venice, when survival still hung in the balance, and when power was still measured in spoons, not swords. Before ships, before silk, before gold, there was salt. In this section, we begin with the quiet foundations of Venice, how a city built on mudflats carved its future from saline water, and how a mineral now thrown on sidewalks once shaped the wealth of republics. Venice didn't begin as a city of grandeur. It began as a refuge. In the 5th and 6th centuries, waves of Germanic invasions swept across Italy, Goths, Huns, Lombards, scattering the Roman populations inland. To escape, many fled to the marshy islands of the Venetian lagoon, an inhospitable tangle of tidal mudflats, sandbars, and shifting waters. There, amid the reeds and mosquitoes, they built shelters of wood and reed, sinking oak pilings into the mud. It was damp, exposed, salt-sprayed, but it was safe. No invader dared cross the mire. And here, these refugees began to trade fish, timber, and most importantly, salt. In the medieval world, salt was essential, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. It preserved meat and fish before refrigeration, it cured hides for leather, it flavored bland food, it was required in bread baking and cheese making, it had roles in medicine, dyeing, and religious rituals. Most critically, salt preserved food. Without it, long-term storage was nearly impossible. Armies, ships, and cities needed salt to survive winters and sieges. Salt didn't just season, it sustained. And so, salt became a currency, sometimes more valuable than gold. In this landscape of scarcity, Venice held an advantage. The shallow, warm waters of the lagoon were ideal for salt production. Salt was not mined in Venice. It was evaporated. In the salt flats, or saline, workers built low rectangular basins. Seawater was allowed to flood in during high tide and left to sit in the sun. Over days or weeks, as the water evaporated, salt crystals formed on the clay bottom. Workers then raked these into piles, drained the residual brine, and carried the salt in woven baskets. The work was monotonous, labor-intensive, and seasonal. Salt raking required dry summers, calm winds, and patience. But it was repeatable, predictable, and, with careful management, endlessly renewable. As Venice grew, its leaders, the early doge and merchant councils, quickly realized that salt was more than a trade good. It was a strategic asset. They established municipal control over the saline in Chioggia, Comacchio, and the northern lagoon. Production was taxed. Storage was centralized. Distribution was regulated. Eventually, the state assumed full control over the salt trade, not just production, but import, export, and pricing. This system became known as the Salt Office, Officio del Sale, and it formed the financial backbone of the early Venetian state. Salt financed military ships. Salt funded palaces. Salt built canals. By the 10th century, Venetian ships carried salt across the Adriatic and into the Po River Valley. Barges moved it up inland canals. Merchants traded it for grain, timber, wine, and wool. Over time, Venice developed exclusive salt trade rights with key cities, Verona, Padua, Milan. They offered stable prices, guaranteed deliveries, and protection via Venice's growing fleet. In return, these cities agreed not to trade salt with Venice's rivals. This wasn't just commerce. It was economic diplomacy, and it bound the region's food supply and survival to the Lagoon Republic. Venice's control of salt allowed it to exert quiet political influence. Cities that rebelled saw their salt supply cut. Rivals who produced their own salt faced tariffs and pressure. Allies were rewarded with salt discounts or exclusive distribution rights. Small towns could be brought into the Venetian orbit with a simple promise: steady, affordable salt. In this way, salt became a tool of soft power, binding cities more effectively than swords. And the people? They rarely noticed. Salt arrived in sacks. It was priced in measures. Its origin seemed secondary. But the price they paid often flowed back into Venetian coffers. The Venetians came to see themselves in the salt. It was elemental, refined, harsh, but necessary. It did not spoil, but it could sting. It traveled easily, but left a mark. It preserved life and enhanced flavor. Just like Venice, salt shaped the city's identity as traders, managers, and custodians of the essential. The Doge didn't speak of it often. There were no parades for salt. But in every ledger, every warehouse, every merchant contract, salt loomed. It was empire, crystallized. Venice's salt empire was not unchallenged. Genoa, its maritime rival, developed its own salt routes. Ancona and the Papal States tried to undercut prices inland producers in Bavaria, and Salzburg threatened to open new markets. Venice responded with quiet ruthlessness, undercutting prices temporarily, buying up surplus salt from competitors, and dumping it cheaply, pressuring client cities to boycott rival salt, using naval force to block salt convoys. This wasn't open war. It was commerce with a knife. But the result was the same: Venetian dominance of salt for centuries. Picture it. Morning sun heats the shallow pan. A worker wades through ankle-deep brine. He scrapes slowly, methodically, guiding white crystals toward a pile. A boy refills the pan from a channel, watching for overflows. Salt dries on woven mats. The foreman measures the output. A small note is scribbled in a wax tablet. 3 baskets, firm grain, dry wind. No bells, no banners, just the quiet ritual of empire building, one flake at a time. Salt, today, is everywhere. It's cheap, overlooked. We throw it on icy sidewalks and season pasta without thought. But once it built palaces, armed fleets, controlled cities, and all from water, sun, and patience. So the next time you sprinkle a pinch from your kitchen counter, ask, what other empires have been quietly built from things we no longer think about at all? The warehouses smell of damp wood and time. Stacked neatly in long rows, great sacks of salt are recorded, weighed, taxed, and accounted for. Clerks scratch tallies into ledgers. Gondolas and galleys glide into the harbor, hulls heavy with the pale mineral that has become the quiet currency of the Republic. Salt is no longer just a survival tool. It is now a system of control, taxation, and infrastructure. And behind it stands a vast administrative machine. In this section, we explore the growth of Venice's salt bureaucracy, how it managed this essential good, used it to build cities and armies, and turned a dull white powder into a symbol of stability and order in a turbulent world. In 1281, Venice formalized its salt management under the Officio del Sale, the Salt Office. It may not sound grand, but this small department controlled one of the most lucrative commodities in the known world. Its responsibilities included supervising production in the lagoons saline, managing salt imports and purchases from third parties, standardizing salt measurements and quality, levying duties and taxes, negotiating exclusive salt contracts with inland cities, enforcing monopoly rights. Clerks, inspectors, and warehouse managers worked under strict protocols. Mistakes were punished. Fraud was investigated. The Salt Office was, in effect, the Republic's quiet treasury. Salt didn't remain in Venice. From the lagoon, it traveled via rivers and trade roads into the heart of northern Italy. Key routes included the Brenta River, leading to Padua and Vicenza, the Adige and Po rivers, reaching Mantua and Ferrara, cart routes overland to Milan and Lombardy, coastal shipments south to Ravenna, Ancona, and even inland to Florence. Venetian merchants and middlemen controlled these routes with meticulous care. They negotiated access, maintained depots, and monitored prices in distant cities. By doing so, Venice made salt distribution a form of regional governance, not through conquest, but through contractual dependence. Venetian officials were master negotiators. They offered cities exclusive salt access in exchange for Fixed annual payments, trade concessions, military neutrality, or alliance use of roads and port cities that agreed became part of the Venetian salt system. Their supplies regulated, their prices stabilized. Cities that refused? They faced sudden salt shortages, price spikes, or, at times, direct naval blockades. This created an informal salt empire, stretching across northern Italy, built not with force, but with dependable delivery. Salt kept the food edible. Salt kept the peace. Salt is durable. It stores well. This allowed Venice to build up surpluses in lean years or times of war. Warehouses, magazzini del sale, lined the edges of the city and its outposts. Some held hundreds of tons. Inventories were reviewed monthly, and stored salt was rotated to maintain quality. In years of crop failure, Venetian salt could be exchanged for grain. During siege or blockade, salt rations were controlled, carefully distributed to avoid unrest. In this way, salt functioned as a strategic reserve, a commodity of last resort, hoarded and deployed like coinage or weapons. The income from salt taxation was immense. By the 14th century, salt duties accounted for up to 30% of Venice's public revenue. That money funded naval shipyards, the famed arsenal, construction of canals, bridges, and fortresses, salaries for public officials, stipends for soldiers and sailors, public welfare, and famine relief. Every grain of salt sold in Padua or Ferrara helped build the ships that protected them. This financial model, low-cost production, high-margin distribution, allowed Venice to compete with larger kingdoms while maintaining a relatively small territorial footprint. Venetian galleys did more than explore. They delivered salt. Many military expeditions doubled as trade missions, with hulls filled with salt, wool, and grain. Salt shipments justified the presence of warships in foreign ports, from the Dalmatian coast to Cyprus. When Venice claimed Crete, it immediately expanded the island's salt flats. In the Peloponnese, it secured exclusive salt rights from local rulers. Wherever Venetian banners flew, salt followed, or perhaps led the way. With high profits came temptation. Salt smuggling was a constant issue by rival cities, rogue merchants, or even Venetian officials. Smugglers would import salt from Sicily or Sardinia at lower prices, hide it among barrels of wine or olives, sell it illegally in cities under Venice's monopoly, bribe customs agents to look the other way. To fight this, Venice created salt inspectors, Salaroli, imposed heavy fines and confiscations, used informants and anonymous tip boxes, occasionally executed repeat offenders. Even so, the salt economy was too vast to fully police. Corruption may have cost the Republic millions, but it never truly threatened its salty foundation. At the bottom of this economic pyramid stood the salt workers. They formed guilds, small associations with specific roles. Rakers who collected salt from pans, carriers who transported sacks, packers who loaded ships, watchmen who protected stockpiles, boilermen who processed raw brine in coastal outposts. Their work was seasonal, hot, and exhausting. The pay was modest. Housing near salt pans was rudimentary. Still, their labor kept the city fed and funded. And though their names are lost, their fingerprints remain in ledger margins, shipping manifests, and salt-streaked docks. Salt permeated daily life in Venice. Bakers were allocated salt quotas, public baths had salt heating regulations, poor citizens received salt rations during food shortages, salt markets were regulated by the Council of 40. Venice's judicial overseers. Salt was so central that disputes over its price or purity could lead to formal lawsuits. Even religious institutions paid salt taxes, despite their exemptions from many other duties. Salt was civic. Salt was sacred. And salt, quietly, kept the whole republic in balance. Today, we think of salt as flavor, not finance. But in Venice, it was the first ledger entry, the first cargo, the first tax, the first thing stored, counted, protected, and sometimes stolen. It funded an empire, not through force, but through organization. And so we ask, how many of history's greatest powers were not built on what they fought for, but on what they could consistently deliver? The salt pans glimmer still. The lagoon remains shallow, tidal, and calm. But the power that once moved silently with every grain of salt now begins to erode. Other cities rise. Trade routes shift. A new world opens across the Atlantic. Venice, once the elegant salt broker of Europe, begins to recede into quiet dignity. But the salt does not vanish. In this final section, we follow the late chapters of Venice's salt empire, how it declined, what replaced it, and what remains in the brined echoes of warehouses, canals, and contracts that once shaped the destiny of the Adriatic. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe transformed. The age of exploration redirected trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Portugal and Spain discovered new oceanic trade routes. Around Africa, across to the Americas, salt production expanded in the New World, and in France's massive saltworks at Guérande and Aigues-Mortes, new preservation methods, especially smoking and pickling, reduced dependence on salt suddenly. Venice was no longer the center of salt. It was just one salt power among many. And when competition grew, the margins thinned. Venice was a maritime republic. Its power came from its position, but also its limitations. It had no large inland territory. It relied on diplomatic control over client cities rather than annexation. Its lagoon was ideal for salt, but not for large-scale agriculture or population growth as larger nation-states emerged. France, Spain, the Ottoman Empire. Venice found itself geopolitically boxed in. Salt contracts grew harder to enforce. Client cities demanded better deals or defected. Rivals, like the Habsburgs and the Papal States, created tariff barriers to Venetian salt. What had once been an elegant monopoly became an ongoing bureaucratic battle. By the 17th century, the Ufficio del Sale was still operating, but its influence had shrunk. It focused more on domestic distribution than international control. Its role became one of taxation rather than empire building. The office managed salt rations during war and plague, ensured supply to Venetian bakeries and fisheries, maintained inland transport canals and depots, but its heyday, when it dictated salt prices across northern Italy, was over. The quiet machinery of control had become a civil service. In the 1700s, salt smuggling returned with renewed intensity. Inland cities ignored Venetian pricing. Local salt works reopened. Despite treaties, contraband salt from Sicily and Sardinia entered through back channels. Even Venetian citizens, facing high taxes, turned to illegal salt markets. The government responded with new laws, inspections, and patrols, but enforcement was inconsistent. Eventually, the cost of defending the salt monopoly exceeded its benefit. The system was breaking. But like the salt itself, it crumbled slowly. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into northern Italy. Venice, weakened by centuries of slow decline and political isolation, surrendered. The Serenissima, after over 1,000 years, was dissolved. Napoleon's administration dismantled many of Venice's bureaucracies, including the salt office. Salt production continued. Trade persisted, but the system was gone. The elegant web of contracts, prices, privileges, and river routes, all unraveled. Venice became part of Austria, then later Italy, and the lagoon's salt pans were repurposed, downsized, or abandoned. Today, you can still see them. Long stone buildings with thick walls and high windows, faint traces of merchant markings on stone doorframes, rusted hooks, where barges once moored, stretches of canal with names like Fondamenta del Sale. The buildings remain, some now converted into apartments, museums, or restaurants. The salt has vanished, but the infrastructure of it remains, in the very shape of the city. Venice did not grow despite salt. It grew around it. Venetians remember. Salt is in the cuisine: bacala mantecato, sard and sour, preserved meats, and salted olives. Salt is in the language, in the place names, in the idioms. Salt is in the patina of the stone, the erosion of marble steps where salt water has licked the city's foundations for centuries. It is no longer currency, but it remains memory. Globally, salt is now mined and industrialized. It seasons our food, de-ices our roads, preserves chemicals. It is cheap, ubiquitous, barely noticed. And yet, it continues to bear traces of the old systems. Salt taxes remain a political issue in some nations. Monopolies exist in regions where salt is scarce. In some developing countries, salt remains a public utility. Venice was not alone. It was simply among the first to perfect the model. A model where a common good becomes the spine of civilization. What does salt teach us? That necessity, more than luxury, shapes empires, that the most powerful systems are often the least visible, that administration can build what armies cannot, that the humble when well managed, can become monumental. Venice built its wealth not by having the rarest good, but by delivering the most essential one with relentless consistency. As you sprinkle salt on your food tonight, it will disappear. It will dissolve. It will leave no trace but taste. But remember, once, men labored in the sun for days to collect it. Once, fleets sailed to deliver it. Once, cities surrendered to possess it. Once, an empire financed its entire future on its promise. And so we ask, what common thing, sitting quietly in your cupboard today, might have once held the power to build, or break, a world? It is 1785 in England. The air smells of coal smoke and wet clay. A laborer shapes a damp brick by hand and lays it on a wooden rack. He wipes his brow. Behind him, rows of drying bricks stretch into the haze. Each one, uniform and dull, now carries an invisible burden, a government tax. It is a quiet tax, one no one notices at first. Just a penny, halfpenny, or farthing, but multiplied across millions of bricks, and a nation rebuilding itself after decades of war and urban fire. It begins to weigh heavily. This is the story of England's brick tax, a boring but quietly disruptive policy that altered buildings, shaped skylines, birthed black markets, and left strange scars on the very walls that surround us. In the late 18th century, Britain was exhausted. The costly American War of Independence had ended in 1783. National debt soared past £250 million, a staggering sum at the time. Interest payments alone consumed nearly 60% of the budget. The government needed money, and fast. But raising income taxes would provoke outrage among the landowning classes. So Parliament turned, as it often did, to commodity taxation, goods people couldn't avoid using. And few materials were more essential, or more invisible, than bricks. Bricks were the literal foundation of the expanding British world. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, new building regulations encouraged brick over wood. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds were growing rapidly in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Brick kilns lined rivers and coasts. Easy to regulate and tax, bricks were heavy and immobile. Difficult to smuggle or hide, they were the perfect target. Common, traceable, and unavoidable. And so, in 1784, the Brick Duties Act was passed. It came into effect the following year. The initial duty imposed was 4 shillings per 1,000 bricks. It may not sound like much, but when a typical 2-story home required 40,000 to 70,000 bricks, the tax added up to £14 per structure, the equivalent of several months' wages for a working-class laborer. The tax would be raised multiple times, eventually peaking at 5 shillings and 10 pence per 1,000 by the 1830s. All bricks had to be officially stamped before firing. The stamp denoted payment and compliance. Failure to comply resulted in fines, confiscation, or imprisonment. Builders, always adaptive, began to look for loopholes. Since the tax was per brick, not per weight or volume, the incentive was clear: make bigger bricks. Brickmakers developed double bricks, the same height and width, but twice the length. These required less mortar, fewer handling steps, and have the number of taxed units. Some bricks grew so large they were difficult to handle, creating new safety issues. The government responded in 1803 by introducing a graduated tax based on brick size. But the pattern had begun. Architects and masons began thinking in units, not structures. Another innovation was the perforated brick. Since the tax was based on number, not mass, some manufacturers began producing hollow-core bricks, large, lightweight, and structurally sound. These weren't always legal. Inspectors would inspect dimensions, wall strength, and load-bearing capacity. Some were banned. Others were tolerated. Enforcement was inconsistent. The result? Buildings in the same city, or even the same street, had wildly different wall materials, simply due to how cleverly their bricks avoided taxation. All bricks sold during the tax period had to be officially stamped by the manufacturer. These stamps were often pressed into the wet clay. Some bore the maker's initials, others a numerical code. Inspectors visited kilns and warehouses to verify compliance. Today, these brick stamps are prized by archaeologists and collectors. They tell stories of which brickyards operated when and where, which builders complied or didn't, how different regions adapted to tax pressure. Ironically, a policy meant to raise money left behind a durable archaeological footprint. still visible in ruins and basements across England. The brick tax had different impacts across Britain. In urban centers, it raised construction costs, but didn't stop growth in rural areas, where local, informal brickmaking was common. It caused severe disruption. Small-scale producers couldn't afford inspectors or stamps. Some communities reverted to stone, timber, or cob to avoid the duty. Thus, a national tax contributed to regional architectural divergence. City buildings leaned toward red brick, while rural areas stuck with local traditions. In some places, the tax froze development altogether. Wherever there are taxes, there are evaders. Illegal brickmakers began operating unregistered kilns, especially in forests and rural clearings. These wild kilns, operated at night, produced unstamped bricks, sold them cheaply to desperate builders. Some local officials turned a blind eye. Others cracked down. Cases were brought before magistrates. Fines were issued. Bricks were destroyed. But the practice persisted and contributed to a growing resentment of government overreach in working communities. In a further twist, even government buildings were not exempt. Workhouses, public hospitals, police stations, military barracks all paid the brick tax. The state taxed itself, transferring money from one office to another, simply because there was no legal exemption mechanism. It was the administrative equivalent of a snake eating its tail, and it further illustrated how deeply the tax had embedded itself into the fabric and absurdity of British policy. Despite all this, Britain built on. Cities expanded. Bricks were still used, but their shape, quality, and size bore the mark of fiscal interference. Walls grew taller, but thinner. Bricks grew longer, but weaker. Architectural creativity was bent, subtly, and sometimes awkwardly, by the logic of taxation. And so, we ask, what does it mean when even the walls we live within are shaped by the quiet decisions of distant clerks and legislators? The wall is uneven, not by accident, but by calculation. A builder pauses, eyeing the freshly laid bricks, checking the alignment. Each one bears the faint trace of a government stamp. Behind him, a laborer unloads a cart of double-length bricks. They're heavier than usual, awkward to grip, but they cut the tax burden nearly in half. This is England in the early 19th century, a nation booming with factories and chimneys, workers and warehouses. And everywhere, behind the noise of progress, the brick tax continues to shape the most fundamental units of life: homes, walls, fireplaces, and identity. This section explores the built legacy of the brick tax, how it reshaped British architecture, who it benefited and who it harmed, and how its influence endures in the lines and shadows of every old English street. The Industrial Revolution brought with it massive urban growth, a surge in demand for worker housing, new factories, mills, schools, and civic buildings, a new urban middle class, eager to own brick homes, but the brick tax added substantial cost to every project. For a modest terrace house, requiring up to 60,000 bricks, the tax could add 10 to 20 to total construction costs. For larger public buildings, the costs were staggering. Developers adapted by using cheaper materials for interior walls, mixing brick facades with timber frame backs, reducing ornamentation to conserve brick count, favoring shared chimneys between homes. The brick tax didn't just change costs. It began to change the very shape of neighborhoods. In high-density cities like London, Bristol, and Birmingham, row houses became the norm. But under the brick tax, designers looked for efficiencies. Narrower frontages reduced the number of outer-facing bricks. Longer buildings with shared party walls, conserved materials, stacked fireplaces on common flues, reduced chimney count. This led to the development of the terraced house as a dominant form. It was not only economical to heat, it was economical to tax. What we now think of as a charming architectural style was, in part, a bureaucratic workaround. To reduce brick use, some builders constructed homes with stone, flint, or cob, but faced only the front with brick-used brick slips, thin, tile-like bricks. To imitate full masonry, left rear or side walls untreated. Plain, utilitarian. Tax minimized. This gave rise to a peculiar aesthetic: polished fronts, rough backs. Even public buildings followed this rule, prioritizing facades over hidden walls. The result was a kind of architectural illusion, shaped more by policy than pride. Fancy brickwork, arches, cornices, patterns, required extra bricks. So under the tax, such features became more expensive. Builders abandoned decorative brick flourishes, simplified designs to flat, undecorated walls, replaced ornamentation with cheaper materials like wood or plaster. Thus, the ornamental restraint seen in many Georgian and early Victorian buildings wasn't purely an aesthetic choice. It was, often, a fiscal necessity. In this way, the brick tax shaped not just how buildings stood, but how they expressed themselves. For the working class, the tax's consequences were harsher. Rented homes became more cramped to conserve brick, fewer windows were installed, compounding the effects of the existing window tax. Substandard materials were used to cut corners. Builders sometimes reused old, brittle bricks, increasing risk of collapse in dense neighborhoods. This led to unsanitary conditions, damp walls, and poorly ventilated rooms. The brick tax, intended to raise revenue, indirectly exacerbated urban poverty. And when fire or disease struck, these thin-walled homes offered little protection. Though the hearth tax had been repealed in the 17th century, the brick tax brought its own consequences for hearth design. Builders reduced the number of chimneys, they stacked fireplaces vertically to reuse flues. Shared chimney stacks became common in terrace housing. This reduced the number of heated rooms in poorer homes, especially upper floors. In winter, entire families might live, cook, and sleep in a single ground floor room, simply because a second hearth would require another chimney, and therefore, more taxed bricks. Chimneys are built of bricks, often thousands. So the tax discouraged tall stacks, ornate tops, or multiple flues. Some builders opted for shared chimney blocks that served 4 or more homes. Others used single flue chimneys, even where safety or ventilation suffered. This led to a distinctive silhouette in English towns: rows of uniform, squat chimney stacks, often without decorative caps or cowls. What we now see as a quaint historical feature was often the product of cost avoidance. Despite restrictions, creativity found a way. In the north, where stone was plentiful, builders switched away from brick entirely. In East Anglia, timber framing returned. In rural construction, some architects embraced brick minimalism, using clean lines and restrained forms as part of a neoclassical aesthetic. In this way, the tax didn't just suppress creativity, it redirected it. England's regional architectural diversity expanded in response to what was, on paper, a flat national policy. The brick tax was never popular. Builders and architects lobbied against it. Public health officials criticized it for contributing to poor housing conditions. Clergy complained about the cost of building new churches. Even some members of parliament called it a tax on shelter. But because it affected everyone quietly and no one dramatically, it persisted. The anger was diffuse, the resentment layered like mortar, visible only when you knew to look. Walk down any old English street, and you'll see its shadow. Thin walls and narrow homes, short chimneys, flat facades, simple layouts, reused flues, brick stamps in the foundations. The brick tax didn't stop buildings from rising, but it altered how they were built. And so, we're left to consider, what else in our world, in the shape of our homes, our streets, our skylines, has been quietly formed not by design, but by duty? The wall still stands. It's been there for 2 centuries, plain, weathered, and dull red. If you run your fingers along the bricks, you might find a faint stamp, long eroded by time. That stamp once meant duty had been paid, that this brick, and thousands like it, helped keep the British treasury afloat. But today, there's no inspector, no tallyman. The tax is gone, quietly repealed. Its legacy, though, is etched into the very cities it once tried to shape. This final section explores the fall of the brick tax, the built consequences it left behind, and the lingering lesson that even the most boring policies can outlast generations in clay and stone. By the 1840s, the brick tax was under increasing criticism. Urban reformers blamed it for unhealthy housing. Public health officials linked cramped, poorly ventilated homes to outbreaks of cholera and typhus. Architects complained that it stifled design. Builders argued it raised costs. During a time of mass industrial migration into cities, the political mood was changing. The repeal of the Corn Laws, 1846, had signaled a broader shift toward free trade and deregulation. Taxes on basic necessities, salt, soap, windows, were under fire. And in this climate, the brick tax finally reached its breaking point. On July 5, 1850, After 65 years in force, the brick tax was repealed. There was no great celebration, no public festival. But in brickyards across Britain, the mood was electric. Manufacturers discarded government-mandated molds, increased production without fear of punitive oversight, introduced new shapes, sizes, and colors to meet demand, and just like that, an invisible restraint on the nation's architecture vanished overnight. The years immediately after repeal saw a dramatic rise in brick production. New brickworks opened across the country. Rural areas that had been priced out of brick began building again. Urban developers seized the chance to build more affordable, higher quality housing. Architects rejoiced. Builders innovated. The variety of brick forms exploded, from slender Roman bricks to deep red London stocks. In public projects especially, schools, post offices, train stations, ornamental brickwork flourished, with arches, patterns, and colored coursing that had been rare under the tax. The built environment grew richer, more expressive, and more varied. After the repeal, many builders returned to traditional brick sizes, not because they had to, but because they could. Standardization improved. Manufacturers introduced better firing techniques, using coal-fired kilns and mass production to lower costs. Previously taxed designs, such as perforated bricks, fire bricks, and facing bricks, were refined and reintroduced. The brick, once a tool of compliance, became a tool of creativity again. Perhaps the most important legacy of the repeal was improved housing for the poor. More spacious floor plans, better ventilation and insulation, reduced construction costs, passed, sometimes, to tenants. Public housing initiatives made feasible by lower material expenses. The removal of the brick tax didn't solve poverty, but it removed one barrier to healthier, safer, and more dignified living. In a time before electricity and indoor plumbing, walls mattered. The repeal made it easier to build better ones. Though the tax vanished, its echoes remained. Brick stamps remained visible for decades. Older homes retained their narrow chimneys and slim facades. Builders still used some double-sized bricks, now for structural reasons rather than fiscal ones. Even today, you can walk along older English terraces and see the seams between pre-1850 and post-1850 construction. A sudden flourish, a deeper red, a decorative string course. These are not just architectural styles, they are fiscal timestamps. The brick tax is a case study in how policy shapes design, not through intent, but through necessity. It taught builders to be frugal, creative, and sometimes rebellious. It also taught lawmakers a lesson they seem to forget with every generation. If you tax the fundamentals of life, you don't just raise revenue. You change the way people live, build, and imagine space. Even the most forgettable policies leave marks in footprints, elevations, and silhouettes. The brick tax was not unique. France taxed windows, causing bricked-up facades that still haunt Parisian suburbs. Russia taxed beards under Peter the Great. India taxed salt, famously protested by Gandhi in the Salt March of 1930. Italy taxed shadows, charging cafes based on how far awnings extended into public space. Each of these taxes reshaped behavior, buildings, and culture. And like England's brick tax, many were repealed only after their damage had been laid in stone. Today, we rarely think about bricks. They're cheap, generic, hidden behind plaster or paint. But they are the most reliable record of intention in any building. They show what mattered structurally, politically, financially. They also show what was feared: waste, inspection, enforcement. Each one carries a legacy of decisions, debates, and compromises made far from the construction site. Next time you walk past a long red terrace in Manchester, or a soot-darkened mill in Leeds, or a stamped brick in a pub cellar, pause. You're looking at the past made tangible. A forgotten argument, fired in clay. You're touching the product of a tax that tried to raise pennies but ended up reshaping cities, compressing homes, and inspiring quiet rebellion. And so, the final question remains: how many of the ordinary things we see every day are really just the long shadows of rules we no longer remember, but which still shape the walls around us?